Before we begin tonight's journey together, take a moment to settle in wherever you are. Notice your breathing, let it slow and deepen naturally. Release whatever thoughts or worries you carried with you today, and allow yourself to drift into the space between waking and sleeping where stories come alive and mysteries unfold. Welcome to Sleepy Side Stories, where we explore the curious corners of our world through tales that soothe the mind while stirring the imagination. If you find comfort in these midnight wanderings, consider subscribing so you can drift off with us again and again, discovering new mysteries to carry you gently into sleep. Tonight, we venture into the heartland of America, to the small town of Stanbury, Missouri, where in the mid-1990s, a young man named Mike Markham captured the attention of late-night radio listeners across the nation. Known to the world as Madman Marcum, he claimed to have stumbled upon something extraordinary while tinkering in his backyard, a discovery that would thrust him into the strange realm of paranormal radio and ultimately into legend itself. Mike Markham was 21 years old when he first called into Coast to Coast AM, Art Bell's iconic late-night radio show that served as a beacon for those drawn to the unexplained. What made Markham different from the countless other callers who phoned in with tales of UFO sightings or ghostly encounters was the specificity of his claim and the tangible evidence that seemed to support it. He wasn't just telling stories. He was building something, experimenting with forces he barely understood, and documenting results that defied easy explanation. The device that brought Markham to national attention was deceptively simple in concept, yet profound in its alleged implications. Starting with what's known as a Jacob's ladder, a classic electrical demonstration device that creates climbing arcs of electricity between two metal poles. Markham had modified the setup in ways that he claimed produced unexpected and extraordinary effects. Where most Jacob's ladders simply created sparks that danced upward between the poles, Markham's contraption seemed to be tearing holes in the very fabric of reality itself. His story began modestly enough. Like many young people drawn to electronics and experimentation, Markham had been fascinated by high-voltage demonstrations. The Jacob's ladder, with its mesmerizing display of electrical arcs, represented a perfect combination of scientific principle and visual spectacle. But Markham wasn't content to simply watch the sparks dance. He wanted to understand the underlying forces, to push the boundaries of what the device could do. What happened next would become the foundation of one of the most enduring mysteries in modern paranormal lore. According to Markham's own account, his modified Jacob's ladder began producing effects that went far beyond mere electrical display. He described seeing what appeared to be a shimmering heat-like distortion in the air above the device, a circular anomaly that seemed to bend light and space around it. This wasn't just heat shimmer from the electrical activity. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to respond to objects passed through it in impossible ways. The young inventor's claims might have remained confined to his small Missouri community, dismissed as the fantasies of an overzealous amateur scientist, had it not been for a series of events that would bring his work to the attention of law enforcement and, subsequently, to the wider world. His experiments required massive amounts of electrical power, far more than his home's electrical system could provide. In his quest to build a larger, more powerful version of his device, Markham made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life forever. In January of 1995, 6 large electrical transformers disappeared from the St. Joseph Light and Power generating station in King City, Missouri. Each transformer weighed over 300 pounds and was worth thousands of dollars. These weren't the kind of items that someone could simply walk away with unnoticed. The theft represented a serious crime, one that local law enforcement took very seriously. When Gentry County Sheriff Eugene Lupfer arrived at Markham's home with a search warrant on January 29, 1995, he found exactly what he expected to find: the stolen transformers wired into an elaborate electrical setup that seemed to serve no conventional purpose. What he didn't expect to find was a young man who would claim that these transformers were essential components in humanity's first functional time machine. Faced with serious theft charges and the prospect of substantial jail time, Markham made what he later described as a calculated decision. Rather than attempting to deny the theft or offer conventional explanations for his actions, he decided to tell the truth about what he was trying to build. If the authorities thought he was insane, he reasoned, he might end up in a mental health facility rather than prison, a preferable outcome given the circumstances. The local media picked up the story, and it was this news coverage that eventually brought Markham to the attention of Art Bell and the Coast to Coast AM audience. Bell, always on the lookout for compelling stories that blurred the line between science and the supernatural, recognized something special in Markham's tale. Here was someone who wasn't just claiming to have experienced something extraordinary. He was actively trying to recreate it, to understand it, to harness it for practical purposes. When Markham first appeared on Coast to Coast AM on April 18, 1995, he became an instant sensation among the show's dedicated audience. Late-night radio listeners, accustomed to stories of alien abduction and ghostly encounters, found themselves captivated by this young man's methodical approach to what seemed to be genuine scientific discovery. His descriptions of the experimental setup were detailed and technically coherent. His accounts of the strange effects he observed were consistent and matter-of-fact. But what truly set Markham apart was his openness about both his successes and his failures. He didn't claim to understand everything about what was happening with his device. He freely admitted when he didn't know something, or when an experiment hadn't worked as expected. This honesty, combined with his obvious enthusiasm for the work, created a compelling portrait of a genuine investigator rather than a mere storyteller. The response to Markham's first appearance on the show was overwhelming. Listeners flooded the Coast to Coast AM phone lines with questions, offers of assistance, and expressions of support. Some were fellow experimenters who offered technical advice. Others sent money to help fund his research. Still others provided equipment and materials that Markham needed to continue his work. For a young man from a small Missouri town, the sudden national attention must have been both exhilarating and overwhelming. Markham found himself at the center of a community of believers and skeptics, supporters and critics, all drawn together by his extraordinary claims. The quiet backyard laboratory in Stanbury became a focal point for anyone interested in the possibility that time travel might be more than just science fiction. But fame, as Markham would discover, comes with its own complications. The attention that his Coast to Coast AM appearance brought wasn't entirely welcome. Curious visitors began showing up at his home at all hours, hoping to see the time machine for themselves or to meet the man who claimed to have built it. The pressure of constant scrutiny, combined with the technical challenges of his ongoing research, created a complex web of circumstances that would ultimately lead to one of the most puzzling disappearances in modern American folklore. In 1996, Markham returned to Coast AM with updates on his progress. He had used the support from listeners to build a new, more powerful version of his device. This second-generation machine was designed to create effects large enough for a human being to enter. A full-scale time machine that would allow him to test his theories on himself, rather than just on inanimate objects. During this second appearance, Markham spoke with confidence about his progress and his plans. He claimed to have successfully tested the device on various objects and even small animals, with results that seemed to confirm his theories about the nature of time and space. He spoke of being just 30 days away from completing his work, 30 days from proving once and for all that time travel was not only possible but practical. And then, sometime in 1997, Mike Markham vanished. The disappearance wasn't immediately obvious to the outside world. Markham had never been a public figure beyond his appearances on Coast to Coast AM, and his day-to-day life in Missouri remained largely private. But as months passed without any word from the young inventor, questions began to arise. Had he completed his time machine and used it to travel through time? Had something gone wrong with his experiments? Or had he simply decided to retreat from the public eye and continue his work in secret? The mystery of Mike Markham's disappearance has only deepened over the years. Despite numerous attempts by researchers, journalists and amateur investigators to locate him, no definitive answers have emerged. The Missouri State Highway Patrol has no record of him being reported as a missing person, which suggests that his disappearance may have been voluntary rather than the result of foul play or accident. Yet the absence of official missing person reports only adds to the enigma. If Markham simply wanted to disappear, why hasn't he resurfaced in the decades since? If his time machine experiments succeeded, where or when did he go? And if they failed catastrophically, what happened to the evidence of his work and the man himself? These questions have made Mike Markham something of a folk hero among those interested in fringe science and unexplained phenomena. His story has been retold countless times on internet forums, in podcasts and in late-night conversations between those who wonder what might be possible if we could truly understand the nature of time itself. Tonight we'll explore the full arc of Mike Markham's remarkable journey, from his early experiments with electricity and magnetism to his rise to fame on late-night radio, from his ambitious attempts to build a functional time machine to his mysterious disappearance into the unknown. We'll examine the evidence, consider the theories, and try to understand what drove a young man from small-town Missouri to pursue one of humanity's most impossible dreams. This is a story about ambition and mystery, about the thin line between genius and madness, about the eternal human desire to transcend the limitations of our existence. It's a story that asks us to consider what we really know about the nature of time, space, and the boundaries of the possible. As we settle in for this journey through one of America's most compelling modern mysteries, let yourself drift along with the tale, allowing the questions and possibilities to wash over you like gentle waves. In the space between sleeping and waking, between what we know and what we wonder, sometimes the most extraordinary stories seem almost possible. To truly understand how Mike Markham's story captured the imagination of so many people, we must first step back into the unique landscape of American radio in the mid-1990s. This was a time when the internet was still in its infancy, when most people still relied on traditional media for information and entertainment, and when the airwaves after midnight became a gateway to realms that daylight seemed to forbid. The 1990s represented a golden age for paranormal and alternative radio programming. While mainstream media outlets focused on conventional news and entertainment, a parallel universe existed in the late-night hours, where the boundaries between fact and fiction became beautifully blurred. This was the domain of talk radio hosts who weren't afraid to explore topics that academic institutions dismissed and newspaper editors wouldn't touch. At the center of this nocturnal universe stood one man whose influence on American culture cannot be overstated: Arthur William Bell III, known to millions simply as Art Bell. Broadcasting from his home studio in the remote desert town of Pahrump, Nevada, Bell had created something unprecedented in the world of radio, a nightly gathering place for anyone who believed that reality extended far beyond what conventional wisdom acknowledged. Coast to Coast AM, the show that Bell hosted from 1988 to 2003, wasn't just a radio program, it was a cultural phenomenon that reached into the deepest corners of American society. Broadcasting live from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Pacific Time, the show attracted an audience of millions who tuned in night after night to explore the mysteries that daytime refused to acknowledge. These were people who worked third shifts, insomniacs who found solace in Bell's soothing voice, and curious minds who craved discussions about topics that existed far outside the mainstream. Bell's genius lay not just in his willingness to discuss unconventional subjects, but in the way he approached them. Unlike sensationalistic television shows that treated paranormal topics as mere entertainment, Bell brought a sense of gravitas and genuine curiosity to every conversation. He didn't mock his callers or dismiss their experiences outright. Instead, he listened with the kind of respectful attention that many of his guests had never encountered from any other media figure. The show's format was deceptively simple. Bell would typically begin each evening with a monologue about current events, often focusing on stories that mainstream media had overlooked or underreported. He might discuss unusual weather patterns, mysterious government activities, or scientific discoveries that challenged conventional understanding. But the real magic happened when Bell opened up the phone lines and invited listeners to share their own experiences and observations. This was where Coast to Coast AM became something more than just entertainment. It became a kind of collective exploration of the unknown. Night after night, people would call in to share stories of UFO encounters, ghostly visitations, prophetic dreams, and experiences that defied easy categorization. Bell served as both moderator and translator, helping callers articulate their experiences while maintaining just enough skepticism to keep the conversations grounded. The show's audience was remarkably diverse, spanning every demographic and geographic region. There were scientists and engineers who called in to discuss cutting-edge research that hadn't yet reached mainstream attention. Military personnel shared stories of unusual encounters during their service. Ordinary citizens described extraordinary experiences that had changed their understanding of reality itself. What united this diverse community was a shared sense that the official version of reality, the one presented in textbooks and news broadcasts, was incomplete at best and deliberately deceptive at worst. These were people who believed that governments and institutions had reasons to suppress certain kinds of information, and that the truth about the nature of existence could only be found by looking beyond conventional sources. This was the perfect environment for someone like Mike Markham to emerge. Here was a young man who wasn't just telling stories about unusual experiences. He was actively conducting experiments, documenting results, and attempting to replicate phenomena that mainstream science insisted was impossible. For Bell's audience, Markham represented exactly what they hoped might be possible: a genuine investigator who was making breakthrough discoveries outside the constraints of official academia. The technical quality of Bell's show also contributed to its unique atmosphere. Broadcasting with crystal-clear signal strength that could be received across vast distances, Coast to Coast AM reached listeners in the most remote corners of North America and beyond. Truckers driving through lonely stretches of highway, night shift workers in isolated facilities, and insomniacs lying in bed in the small hours of the morning all found themselves connected through Bell's voice and the shared experience of exploring the unknown together. Bell himself was perfectly suited for this role. His background as a former disc jockey and amateur radio operator had given him both the technical skills to produce a high-quality show and the communication abilities to connect with listeners from all walks of life. His voice, deep, measured, and infinitely reassuring, became a constant companion for millions of people who felt isolated by their unconventional interests and experiences. Perhaps most importantly, Bell possessed a rare combination of open-mindedness and critical thinking that allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters between gullibility and cynicism. He was willing to consider almost any possibility, no matter how outlandish it might seem, but he also asked probing questions that helped separate genuine experiences from obvious fabrications. This balanced approach created an environment where authentic seekers of truth could feel comfortable sharing their stories, while discouraging those who were simply seeking attention or trying to perpetrate hoaxes. The show's influence extended far beyond its direct audience. Ideas and stories that originated on Coast to Coast AM often filtered into broader cultural consciousness through word of mouth, internet forums, and other media outlets. The program became a kind of launching pad for many of the conspiracy theories, paranormal beliefs, and alternative scientific concepts that would define fringe culture for decades to come. In this context, the appearance of Mike Markham on Coast to Coast AM represented something of a perfect storm. Here was a story that combined several elements that were particularly appealing to Bell's audience: cutting-edge scientific experimentation, government suppression of unconventional research, and the possibility that an ordinary person working outside official channels might make discoveries that would revolutionize our understanding of reality. Markham's story also arrived at precisely the right moment in the show's history. By 1995, Coast to Coast AM had been on the air long enough to develop a loyal and engaged audience, but it was still growing in influence and reach. Bell was at the height of his powers as a broadcaster, and the show was attracting increasingly sophisticated and knowledgeable callers who could engage with complex scientific and philosophical topics. The timing was also significant from a broader cultural perspective. The mid-1990s was a period of growing distrust in government institutions and mainstream media, fueled partly by events like the Ruby Ridge siege, the Branch Davidian incident at Waco, and the Oklahoma City bombing. Many Americans were beginning to question official narratives about everything from historical events to scientific discoveries, creating a fertile ground for alternative explanations and unconventional research. At the same time, the decade was marked by rapid technological advancement that made previously impossible things seem suddenly achievable. The internet was beginning to connect people in ways that had never been possible before. Personal computers were becoming powerful enough to handle complex calculations and simulations. New discoveries in physics and astronomy were challenging long-held assumptions about the nature of space, time, and reality itself. For someone like Mike Markham, this cultural moment represented an unprecedented opportunity. Previous generations of amateur inventors and researchers had been largely isolated, unable to reach beyond their local communities to find support, funding, or even understanding for their work. But the combination of Coast to Coast AM's massive audience and the emerging internet culture meant that unconventional researchers could suddenly connect with like-minded individuals across vast distances. The show's format also provided something that traditional media outlets couldn't offer: unfiltered access to a receptive audience. When Markham called into Coast to Coast AM, he wasn't speaking to a skeptical reporter who might twist his words or a television producer looking for sensational sound bites. Instead, he was speaking directly to millions of people who were predisposed to take his claims seriously and consider the implications of what he was reporting. This direct connection between researcher and audience created a feedback loop that had never existed before in the history of scientific communication. Markham could describe his experiments on the air and immediately receive responses from listeners who had technical expertise, funding capabilities, or access to equipment and materials that he needed. Within days of his first appearance on the show, he was receiving packages, phone calls, and letters from people who wanted to support his work. The response to Markham's story also demonstrated something important about Bell's audience. They weren't passive consumers of entertainment, but active participants in a kind of collective investigation. Many listeners had their own technical backgrounds and could engage with the scientific aspects of Markham's work on a sophisticated level. Others had connections to research institutions, government agencies, or private companies that might have relevant information or resources. This collaborative aspect of the Coast to Coast AM community was one of its most remarkable features. Unlike traditional scientific research, which was typically conducted within established institutions and published through peer-reviewed journals, the kind of investigation that took place within Bell's audience was distributed, informal, and driven by curiosity rather than career advancement or institutional priorities. The show also provided a kind of protection for unconventional researchers that they couldn't find anywhere else. By broadcasting their stories to a massive audience, Coast to Coast AM made it much more difficult for government agencies or other institutions to quietly suppress their work. The publicity that came with appearing on the show served as a kind of insurance policy against the kind of intimidation or harassment that many alternative researchers reported experiencing. For Markham specifically, his appearances on Coast to Coast AM transformed him from an isolated amateur experimenter into something approaching a folk hero. His story resonated with listeners who saw in him a representation of their own desire to push beyond conventional boundaries and discover hidden truths about the nature of reality. He became a symbol of the kind of breakthrough that might be possible if someone with enough determination and creativity could work outside the constraints of traditional scientific institutions. The show's influence on Markham's story extended far beyond his initial appearances. Even after he disappeared from public view, Coast to Coast AM continued to serve as a forum for discussing his work and speculating about what might have happened to him. Other guests would reference his experiments, callers would share theories about his disappearance, and Bell himself would occasionally mention the case as an example of the kind of genuine mystery that kept him engaged in his work. Looking back from our current perspective, it's clear that Coast to Coast AM and shows like it served as a bridge between the analog and digital ages of information sharing. The program provided many of the functions that internet forums, social media platforms, and online communities would later fulfill, creating connections between like-minded individuals, facilitating the spread of alternative information, and providing platforms for voices that mainstream media ignored. But there was something about the radio format that these later platforms couldn't replicate. The intimacy of Bell's voice speaking directly into millions of homes created a sense of shared experience that was both personal and communal. Listeners felt as though they were part of a secret society, united by their willingness to consider possibilities that the broader world dismissed. The show also operated with a kind of temporal magic that perfectly suited its subject matter. Broadcasting live in the deep hours of the night, when the boundary between consciousness and dreams becomes thin, Coast to Coast AM existed in a liminal space where extraordinary things seemed more possible than they did in the harsh light of day. The darkness outside seemed to mirror the unknown territories that the show explored, creating an atmosphere where the impossible felt tantalizingly close to the real. This was the world that Mike Markham entered when he first called into Coast to Coast AM on that April evening in 1995. It was a world where his claims about time travel experiments would be taken seriously, where his technical descriptions would be carefully analysed, and where his ultimate disappearance would be seen not as the end of his story, but as the beginning of an even greater mystery. The legacy of this era of late-night radio continues to influence how we think about the boundaries between mainstream and alternative knowledge. The communities that formed around shows like Coast to Coast AM helped establish patterns of information sharing and collective investigation that would later flourish in the digital age. The questions that Bell and his guests explored about the nature of reality, the limits of official knowledge, and the possibility that truth might be stranger than fiction remain as relevant today as they were in the 1990s. And somewhere in the vast archive of coast-to-coast AM broadcasts, preserved on magnetic tape and digital files, the voice of Mike Markham continues to tell his remarkable story, inviting new generations of listeners to wonder what might be possible when curiosity meets determination in the endless quest to understand the mysteries of existence itself. In the rolling hills of northwest Missouri, where vast cornfields stretch toward distant horizons and small towns dot the landscape like islands in an agricultural sea, the community of Stanbury has long embodied the quiet rhythms of rural American life. With a population that has never exceeded 1,500 residents, Stanbury is the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbours, where high school football games draw the entire town, and where unusual behaviour tends to be noticed quickly and discussed thoroughly. It was into this environment that Michael Markham was born in 1974, growing up as part of a generation that would witness the transformation of American society through the rapid advancement of technology and the gradual dissolution of the boundaries that had long separated rural communities from the broader world. Yet even as the internet began to connect distant places and cable television brought urban culture into country homes, Stanbury remained fundamentally unchanged, a place where traditional values and conventional thinking still held sway. From his earliest years, Markham displayed the kind of curiosity and mechanical aptitude that often emerges in young people who grow up in environments where practical problem-solving is a daily necessity. Rural life has always demanded a certain degree of self-sufficiency, and the ability to fix, modify, or improve various mechanical and electrical systems is not just useful, but often essential. In communities like Stanbury, the local hardware store serves as an informal gathering place for men who can discuss the finer points of engine repair with the same passion that urban dwellers might reserve for sports or politics. Markham's interest in electronics and electrical systems became apparent during his teenage years, when he began experimenting with various devices and circuits in ways that went far beyond typical adolescent tinkering. While his peers were focused on cars, sports, or the social dynamics of high school life, Markham found himself drawn to the invisible forces that power our modern world: the flow of electrons through conductors, the generation and manipulation of magnetic fields, and the complex relationships between electricity, magnetism, and the fundamental structure of matter itself. Those who knew him during this period remember a young man who possessed both exceptional intelligence and an unconventional approach to learning. Rather than accepting textbook explanations of how things worked, Markham preferred to investigate phenomena directly through hands-on experimentation. He would take apart electronic devices not just to see how they functioned, but to understand the underlying principles that made their operation possible. This autodidactic approach to learning served Markham well in some ways, allowing him to develop insights and perspectives that might not emerge from traditional educational methods. But it also meant that his understanding of complex scientific principles was sometimes incomplete, or based on assumptions that wouldn't withstand rigorous scrutiny. Like many self-taught investigators, he possessed deep knowledge in certain areas while remaining surprisingly uninformed about related topics that formal education would have covered systematically. Friends and family members who knew Markham during his youth described someone who was both brilliant and eccentric, capable of explaining complex technical concepts with remarkable clarity, while also pursuing lines of investigation that seemed to lead nowhere. He had a reputation for being able to fix almost any electronic device, but he was also known for taking perfectly functional equipment apart simply to see if he could modify it to do something different. The nickname Madman that would later become associated with Markham's public persona did not actually originate in his hometown community. Unlike what some accounts have suggested, this moniker was not something that local residents used to describe him during his youth. Instead, it appears to have emerged from his later appearances on Coast to Coast AM, where the combination of his ambitious claims and unconventional approach to scientific investigation led to the adoption of this colourful descriptor. In Stanbury itself, Markham was known simply as Mike, a somewhat unusual young man with a passion for electronics, but not someone who was considered dangerous or completely disconnected from reality. The distinction is important because it helps us understand that Markham's later experiments and claims represented a gradual evolution of interests and abilities, rather than a sudden break with reality or a descent into obsession. During his late teens and early 20s, Markham's experiments began to focus increasingly on high-voltage electrical phenomena. This was a natural progression for someone with his interests and abilities, but it also represented a significant escalation in both the complexity and the potential dangers of his work. High-voltage electricity is inherently hazardous, capable of causing serious injury or death to anyone who doesn't understand proper safety procedures or who underestimates the forces they're working with. The choice to focus on high-voltage experiments also reflected Markham's growing belief that conventional electrical devices and circuits were insufficient for the kind of investigations he wanted to pursue. He had become convinced that truly breakthrough discoveries would require working with energy levels and electrical phenomena that went far beyond what most amateur experimenters ever attempted. This progression toward increasingly ambitious experiments was facilitated by Markham's living situation during his early 20s. Rather than living in a typical suburban setting, where curious neighbours and homeowners associations might have limited his activities, he had access to space and privacy that allowed him to pursue experiments that would have been impossible in most residential areas. The specific details of Markham's family background and personal history remain somewhat unclear, partly because he was never the subject of extensive biographical investigation during his period of public attention, and partly because many of the people who knew him personally have chosen to maintain their privacy in the years since his disappearance. What we do know comes primarily from his own statements, during his radio appearances, and from the observations of law enforcement officials who investigated his activities. According to police reports from the time of his arrest, Markham was living in Stanbury in a situation that provided him with both the physical space and the electrical infrastructure necessary for his experiments. The presence of multiple electrical transformers throughout different rooms of his residence suggests that he had been working on his projects for some time before the theft that brought him to official attention. Sheriff Eugene Lupfer, who arrested Markham in 1995, later described him as intelligent but obsessed with his electrical experiments. Lupfer's observations provide one of the few outside perspectives on Markham's character and mental state during this crucial period. According to the sheriff, Markham was not someone who seemed mentally unstable or disconnected from reality, but rather someone who had become so focused on his work that he had lost sight of conventional boundaries and limitations. The decision to steal electrical transformers from the local power company represents a crucial turning point in Markham's story. It was this act that transformed him from an obscure amateur experimenter into a local news story and ultimately into a figure of national interest. But understanding why he made this choice requires appreciating both the technical requirements of his experiments and the financial realities that constrained his options. Power transformers are expensive pieces of equipment, particularly the large industrial units that Markham required for his work. For someone living on a modest income in rural Missouri, the cost of purchasing such equipment legally would have been prohibitive. The transformers available at the St. Joseph Light and Power Generating Station in King City represented exactly what he needed for his experiments, and they were apparently accessible in a way that made theft seem feasible. The decision to steal the transformers rather than abandon his experiments or find alternative approaches reveals something important about Markham's personality and priorities. He was someone who was willing to take significant personal risks in order to continue his work. The potential consequences of the theft, criminal charges, jail time, and public exposure, were substantial, but evidently seemed less important to him than the possibility of achieving the breakthrough he believed his experiments might produce. This willingness to prioritize his research above conventional concerns about legality and social acceptance would become a recurring theme throughout Markham's story. It suggests someone who had become so convinced of the importance of his work that normal considerations of risk and reward no longer applied to his decision-making process. The experiments that led to Markham's need for additional electrical power had apparently been ongoing for some time before the transformer theft brought them to public attention. According to his later accounts, he had been working with various configurations of electrical equipment in an attempt to create and study high-voltage phenomena that conventional sources said were either impossible or extremely dangerous. The specific technical details of these early experiments remain somewhat unclear, partly because Markham's own descriptions were sometimes inconsistent or incomplete, and partly because the scientific principles he claimed to be working with are not well understood even by mainstream physics. What seems clear is that he was attempting to create and manipulate electrical and magnetic fields in ways that would produce observable effects on physical objects placed within or near the fields. These experiments represented a significant departure from the kind of amateur electronics work that typically occupied hobbyists and enthusiasts. While most people interested in electronics focus on building devices that accomplish specific practical purposes, radios, amplifiers, computer circuits, and so forth, Markham was conducting what amounted to basic research into the fundamental properties of electromagnetic phenomena. This kind of investigation requires not only technical knowledge and practical skills, but also a theoretical framework for understanding what kinds of effects might be possible and how they might be achieved. For someone working outside the formal scientific establishment, developing such a framework poses significant challenges, since the relevant literature is often highly technical, and the experimental equipment required is both expensive and potentially dangerous. Markham's approach to these challenges reflected both his strengths and his limitations as a self-taught researcher. His willingness to pursue lines of investigation that mainstream science might dismiss as impractical or impossible allowed him to explore possibilities that more conventional researchers might never consider. But his lack of formal training in physics and electrical engineering also meant that he sometimes misunderstood fundamental principles or made assumptions that wouldn't survive careful scrutiny. The combination of genuine insight and incomplete understanding that characterized Markham's work would later make it difficult for experts to evaluate his claims objectively. Some of his technical descriptions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex electromagnetic phenomena, while others revealed gaps in his knowledge that raised questions about the reliability of his observations and conclusions. This mixture of competence and confusion was not unusual among amateur researchers working in cutting-edge areas of science and technology. Throughout history, many important discoveries have been made by individuals working outside established institutions, often because their unconventional perspectives allowed them to see possibilities that trained experts had overlooked. But for every amateur researcher who makes genuine breakthroughs, there are many others whose work, however sincere and dedicated, ultimately leads nowhere. Understanding Mike Markham as a person requires appreciating this context of amateur investigation and self-directed learning. He was someone who possessed genuine technical abilities and insights, but who was also working without the guidance and oversight that formal scientific training typically provides. His story represents both the possibilities and the perils of pursuing advanced scientific research outside institutional frameworks. The portrait that emerges from the available information about Markham's background is that of a young man who was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. In many ways, he was typical of rural American youth, interested in mechanical devices, comfortable with hands-on work, and somewhat skeptical of official authorities and explanations. But he was also someone whose intellectual curiosity and technical abilities set him apart from his peers and led him toward investigations that most people would never attempt. The transformation from small-town electronics enthusiast to nationally known figure claiming to have built a time machine was not sudden or inexplicable, but rather the result of a gradual progression of interests and experiments that eventually reached a point where conventional boundaries and expectations no longer constrained his work. Understanding this progression helps us appreciate both the genuine dedication that drove his research and the circumstances that ultimately led to his mysterious disappearance. As we prepare to explore the specific technical details of Markham's experiments and the extraordinary claims that emerge from his work, it's important to keep in mind this portrait of the man behind the legend, someone who was neither a mainstream scientist nor a simple fantasist, but rather an ambitious amateur investigator whose curiosity and determination led him into territories that few people have ever dared to explore. The journey that would ultimately transform Mike Markham from an unknown electronics enthusiast into one of the most discussed figures in modern paranormal lore began with what seemed like a simple project, the construction of a Jacob's ladder. For those unfamiliar with this classic electrical demonstration device, a Jacob's ladder consists of two metal electrodes arranged in a V-shaped configuration with a high-voltage power source connected between them. When activated, the device creates an electrical arc that starts at the bottom, where the electrodes are closest together, then climbs upward as hot air carries the ionized pathway toward the top where the electrodes are farther apart. Named after the biblical story of Jacob's ladder reaching from earth to heaven, These devices have long fascinated both professional scientists and amateur experimenters with their dramatic visual display of electrical phenomena. The climbing arc seems to defy gravity as it rises between the electrodes, creating a mesmerizing dance of electricity that has captivated observers for more than a century. For someone like Markham, with his deep interest in high-voltage phenomena, building a Jacob's ladder represented both a practical learning exercise and an opportunity to explore the fundamental nature of the electrical discharge. But Markham was not content to simply recreate a standard Jacob's ladder design. From the very beginning, his approach to the project reflected the same innovative thinking that would characterize all of his later work. Rather than accepting the conventional wisdom about how such devices should be constructed and operated, he began experimenting with modifications that he hoped might produce more interesting or useful effects. The most significant modification that Markham made to his Jacob's ladder design involved the integration of a laser system designed to reduce air resistance between the two electrodes. Using a modified compact disc laser, the kind of component that was becoming increasingly available as CD players became common household items, Markham attempted to create a more controlled pathway for the electrical discharge. The theoretical reasoning behind this modification was sound, even if the practical implementation was largely experimental. Air resistance is indeed one of the factors that affects the behavior of electrical arcs, and reducing this resistance could potentially allow for more stable or predictable discharge patterns. By using a laser to ionize the air between the electrodes, Markham hoped to create a more conductive pathway that would allow the electrical arc to behave in ways that might not be possible under normal atmospheric conditions. This kind of creative problem-solving approach demonstrated both Markham's technical ingenuity and his willingness to venture into territory that most amateur experimenters would have avoided. Working with high-voltage electricity is dangerous enough under controlled conditions using established designs and procedures. Attempting to modify such systems using untested approaches and improvised components multiplied both the technical challenges and the potential risks involved. The laser modification also revealed something important about Markham's theoretical framework for understanding electrical phenomena. He was not simply trying to create more impressive visual effects or more powerful electrical discharges. Instead, he was attempting to gain greater control over the fundamental processes involved in electrical arc formation, with the goal of studying effects that might not be observable using conventional approaches. When Markham first activated his modified Jacob's ladder, what he observed defied his expectations and challenged his understanding of what should have been possible. Instead of the familiar climbing arc that characterized conventional Jacob's ladder devices, his apparatus began producing effects that seemed to transcend purely electrical phenomena. According to Markham's own detailed accounts, the most striking anomaly was the appearance of what he described as a circular, heat-like distortion in the air above the device. This was not the kind of heat shimmer that might be expected from any high-temperature electrical discharge. Instead, it was a distinct, stable phenomenon that appeared to bend light and distort the visual field in ways that suggested something far more complex than simple thermal effects. The distortion was consistently circular in shape and appeared to maintain its position relative to the electrical apparatus, rather than drifting or dissipating as conventional heat effects would. Most intriguingly, the phenomenon seemed to respond to the presence of objects in ways that went far beyond what any known form of electromagnetic field should produce. Markham's description of this anomaly was remarkably consistent across multiple interviews and discussions. He spoke of a shimmering effect that created a visible distortion in the air, similar to what one might see when looking across hot pavement on a summer day, but with a distinctly circular boundary and a stability that natural heat effects do not possess. The consistency of these descriptions, combined with Markham's obvious technical knowledge about the equipment he was using, lent credibility to his claims even among skeptical observers. The true test of any unusual phenomenon lies not in its initial observation, but in what happens when investigators attempt to study it systematically through controlled experiments. For Markham, the appearance of the strange distortion effect represented not an endpoint but a beginning, the first indication that his modified Jacob's ladder might be producing effects that warranted serious investigation. His first systematic test was elegantly simple. Taking a small sheet metal screw, a common hardware store item that would be easily replaceable if lost, Markham tossed it through the circular distortion to see what would happen. What he observed in that moment would become the foundation for all of his subsequent claims about time travel and dimensional manipulation. According to Markham's account, the screw disappeared completely for approximately half a second upon passing through the distorted area. This was not a case of the object simply becoming difficult to see due to optical effects or electromagnetic interference. The screw vanished entirely, as if it had ceased to exist in normal space-time, then reappeared several feet away from its original trajectory. The implications of such an observation, if accurate, were staggering. Objects do not simply vanish and reappear in different locations under normal circumstances. The behavior that Markham described suggested that his apparatus might be creating some kind of spatial or temporal distortion that could transport matter instantaneously across distances without passing through the intervening space. Recognizing the extraordinary nature of what he believed he had observed, Markham began conducting additional tests using various objects of different sizes, weights, and materials. His goal was to determine whether the effect was consistent, whether it worked with different types of matter, and whether there were any patterns or limitations that might provide clues about the underlying mechanism. These follow-up experiments reportedly confirmed and expanded upon his initial observations. Objects of various types, metal screws, small tools, pieces of wood and plastic, all seemed to exhibit similar behavior when passed through the distorted area. They would disappear briefly, then reappear in locations that were offset from their original trajectory, by distances ranging from a few inches to several feet. The reappearance locations were not random, according to Markham's observations. Objects seemed to emerge from the phenomenon along predictable directional patterns, though the exact distance and angle varied from test to test. This suggested that whatever was causing the effect operated according to some kind of underlying physical principles, even if those principles were not immediately comprehensible within the framework of conventional physics. Markham also noted that the duration of disappearance remained consistently brief, typically less than 1 second, regardless of the size or composition of the objects being tested. This consistency suggested that the phenomenon was operating according to stable parameters, rather than fluctuating randomly or degrading over time. As word of these experiments began to spread within Markham's local community, primarily through the kind of informal communication networks that exist in small towns, reactions ranged from fascination to skepticism to outright disbelief. Some people were intrigued by the technical aspects of what Markham was attempting and wanted to see demonstrations for themselves. Others dismissed his claims as the fantasies of someone who had spent too much time working with dangerous electrical equipment. The mixed reactions that Markham encountered locally would prove to be a preview of the much broader range of responses that his story would generate once it reached national attention. The fundamental challenge that faced anyone trying to evaluate his claims was the same one that confronts all reports of anomalous phenomena. How do you distinguish between genuine observations of unknown effects and misinterpretations of conventional phenomena? Markham's technical background and his detailed descriptions of his experimental setup lent credibility to his accounts, but they did not constitute independent verification of his extraordinary claims. The scientific method requires that unusual observations be reproducible by independent investigators using similar equipment and procedures. For phenomena as remarkable as what Markham was describing, such replication would be essential before the broader scientific community could take his work seriously. Unfortunately, the specialized nature of Markham's apparatus and the significant safety hazards involved in high-voltage experimentation made independent replication extremely difficult. Few amateur experimenters had the technical knowledge, equipment, and workspace necessary to attempt similar experiments, and professional researchers were unlikely to risk their careers investigating claims that seemed to contradict fundamental principles of physics. This isolation created a situation where Markham found himself as perhaps the only person in the world who was systematically studying the phenomenon he believed he had discovered. While this gave him complete freedom to pursue his investigations without interference or oversight, it also meant that he had no one with whom he could discuss his observations or verify his interpretations. The psychological pressure of being the sole investigator of what might be one of the most important scientific discoveries in human history would have been enormous. If Markham's observations were accurate, he was potentially on the verge of revolutionizing our understanding of space, time, and matter. But if his interpretations were incorrect, he was wasting valuable time and resources pursuing an elaborate delusion. This pressure was compounded by the practical limitations of his experimental setup. The modified Jacob's ladder that had produced the initial anomalous effects was operating at relatively low power levels compared to what Markham believed might be necessary to create larger or more stable phenomena. The equipment he had assembled using his own resources was sufficient for preliminary investigations, but insufficient for the kind of comprehensive study that the phenomenon seemed to warrant. It was this recognition of his equipment limitations that led Markham to begin planning for a larger, more powerful version of his apparatus. If the effects he was observing were real and scalable, then increasing the power input should produce correspondingly larger and more dramatic results. But achieving the power levels he believed were necessary would require electrical equipment far beyond what he could afford to purchase legally. The decision to steal transformers from the local power company was not made lightly or impulsively. Markham understood the legal risks involved, but he had become convinced that the potential scientific benefits justified those risks. In his mind, he was not committing theft for personal gain, but rather acquiring the tools necessary to conduct research that could benefit all of humanity. The 6 transformers that Markham took from the St. Joseph Light and Power Generating Station were not small pieces of equipment. Each unit weighed several hundred pounds and was designed to handle massive amounts of electrical current. Installing and connecting such equipment would have required considerable technical skill and physical effort, reflecting both the ambitious scope of Markham's plans and his determination to see them through regardless of the obstacles involved. With the stolen transformers integrated into his experimental setup, Markham began conducting tests that operated at power levels far exceeding anything he had previously attempted. The effects of these high-power experiments were immediately apparent to everyone in the surrounding neighbourhood, as the massive electrical load caused lights to dim and electrical systems to malfunction across multiple city blocks. These power fluctuations were not subtle effects that could be dismissed or ignored. When Markham activated his enhanced apparatus, the electrical infrastructure of Stanbury struggled to meet the demand, creating brownouts and power quality issues that affected homes and businesses throughout the area. The widespread nature of these electrical disturbances meant that Markham's experiments were no longer a private matter confined to his own property. The high-power version of Markham's apparatus reportedly produced effects that were dramatically amplified compared to what he had observed during his initial experiments. The circular distortion phenomenon became larger and more visually distinct, creating what he described as a shimmering portal, large enough to accommodate objects significantly bigger than the small screws and tools he had used in his preliminary tests. According to Markham's later accounts, these enhanced experiments confirmed his theories about the scalable nature of the phenomenon. Larger objects passed through the distorted area exhibited the same disappearance and reappearance behavior that he had observed with smaller items, but the distances involved in the spatial displacement were correspondingly greater. More significantly, the duration and stability of the anomalous effects seemed to improve with higher power levels. Where his initial experiments had produced brief, intermittent phenomena that required precise timing to observe, the enhanced apparatus could maintain the distortion effect for extended periods, allowing for more systematic study and documentation. These developments convinced Markham that he was indeed working with a genuine physical phenomenon rather than some kind of experimental artifact or perceptual error. The consistent scaling relationships between power input and effect magnitude suggested that whatever was causing the anomalies operated according to discoverable physical laws, even if those laws were not yet understood by conventional science. However, the increased power levels that made these enhanced effects possible also created new challenges and dangers. High-voltage electrical equipment of the type that Markham was using poses serious risks of electrocution, fire and explosion under the best of circumstances. Operating such equipment in experimental configurations that had never been tested or validated multiplied those risks considerably. The widespread electrical disturbances that accompanied Markham's high-power experiments also made it impossible for him to continue his work in secret. The systematic brownouts that occurred whenever he activated his apparatus quickly drew the attention of both the power company and local law enforcement officials, who began investigating the source of the electrical problems. It was this investigation that ultimately led to Markham's arrest on January 29, 1995, when Sheriff Eugene Lupfer discovered the stolen transformers and the elaborate experimental setup that Markham had constructed in his residence. The discovery marked the end of Markham's private research phase and the beginning of his transformation from unknown amateur experimenter to nationally recognized figure in the world of paranormal investigation. The arrest also represented a crucial turning point in the evolution of Markham's story. Up to that point, his claims about time travel and dimensional manipulation had been known only to a small circle of local residents. But the legal proceedings that followed, combined with the media attention that his case generated, would soon bring his extraordinary claims to the attention of a much broader audience, including Art Bell and the millions of listeners who tuned in to Coast AM each night in search of stories that challenged the boundaries of the possible. The transformation of Mike Markham from a local curiosity in rural Missouri to a figure of national fascination began with a single phone call on the evening of April 18th, 1995. Sitting in his modest home in Stanbury, having recently been released from jail after serving a sentence for the transformer theft, Markham made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of his life and secure his place in the annals of modern paranormal lore. Coast AM was already well into its nightly broadcast when Markham's call came through the show's phone system. Art Bell, with his distinctive voice and measured cadence, was fielding the usual mixture of calls that characterized the program, some offering personal experiences with unexplained phenomena, others raising questions about government cover-ups or scientific mysteries, and still others simply seeking connection with a community of like-minded individuals who shared their unconventional interests. But there was something different about Markham's call from the moment Bell picked up the line. Unlike many callers who began with vague or emotional accounts of strange experiences, Markham immediately launched into a detailed, technically precise description of experimental apparatus and observed phenomena. His tone was calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing routine laboratory procedures rather than claims that challenged the fundamental laws of physics. What made Markham's initial appearance on Coast AM so compelling was not just the extraordinary nature of his claims, but the methodical way in which he presented them. He began by describing his background and interests, establishing himself as someone with genuine technical knowledge rather than a casual enthusiast or attention seeker. He explained the theoretical basis for his experiments, the specific equipment he had used, and the step-by-step procedures he had followed to achieve his reported results. Bell, who had interviewed countless individuals claiming various forms of contact with the paranormal or the extraordinary, immediately recognized something special about Markham's account. The young man's technical vocabulary was precise and appropriate. His descriptions were internally consistent, and his willingness to acknowledge limitations and uncertainties in his work suggested genuine scientific thinking rather than the elaborate fantasy. Perhaps most importantly, Markham's story had a crucial element that many paranormal claims lack: independent verification of key facts. His arrest for transformer theft had been covered in local newspapers, providing documented evidence that he had indeed been conducting electrical experiments significant enough to attract law enforcement attention. This tangible connection to verifiable events gave his claims a foundation of credibility that purely subjective experiences could not provide. During that first call, Markham described his progression from simple Jacob's ladder experiments to the discovery of the anomalous spatial distortion effects. He spoke about the circular shimmering phenomenon, the disappearance and reappearance of objects passed through it, and his growing conviction that he had stumbled upon a form of space-time manipulation that conventional science had never anticipated. Bell's response to Markham's account was a masterclass in the interviewing techniques that had made Coast AM such a compelling program. Rather than expressing either blind acceptance or reflexive skepticism, Bell asked probing questions that allowed Markham to elaborate on technical details, while also exploring the broader implications of his claims. The conversation that unfolded over the course of that first interview revealed layers of complexity that went far beyond simple claims about unusual electrical effects. Markham spoke about his theoretical framework for understanding what he believed he had discovered, his plans for future experiments, and his frustrations with the limitations imposed by his current equipment and resources. What emerged was a portrait of a genuine investigator, grappling with phenomena that seemed to transcend conventional scientific understanding. Markham readily admitted when he didn't understand something, or when his experiments had produced unexpected results. He acknowledged the preliminary nature of his work and the need for more sophisticated equipment and methodology, to properly study the effects he had observed. This intellectual honesty, combined with his obvious technical competence, created a compelling case for taking his claims seriously, even if they seemed to contradict established physical principles. Bell and his audience were accustomed to evaluating extraordinary claims, and Markham's presentation met many of the criteria that distinguished potentially legitimate anomalous phenomena from obvious hoaxes or delusions. The response to Markham's first appearance on Coast to Coast AM was immediate and overwhelming. The show's phone lines, which typically handled a steady stream of calls throughout each broadcast, became completely jammed as listeners tried to call in with questions, comments, and offers of assistance. Many callers had technical backgrounds that allowed them to engage with the scientific aspects of Markham's work, while others were simply fascinated by the possibility that someone might have actually achieved a breakthrough in time travel research. But perhaps the most significant response came from listeners who wanted to help Markham continue his research. Within hours of the broadcast, people began calling the phone number that Markham had provided during the show, offering everything from technical advice and equipment donations to financial support for his experiments. The outpouring of assistance was unlike anything that had ever emerged from a single coast-to-coast AM appearance. For Markham, who had been working in isolation with limited resources and no institutional support, this sudden flood of assistance must have been both exhilarating and overwhelming. After months of conducting his experiments in secrecy, he suddenly found himself at the centre of a community of supporters who not only believed in the legitimacy of his work, but were willing to contribute their own resources to help him succeed. The nature of the assistance that listeners offered revealed the sophisticated technical knowledge that existed within the coast-to-coast AM audience. Some callers were engineers who could provide advice on high-voltage electrical systems. Others were amateur radio operators with experience in electromagnetic phenomena. Still others had access to specialized equipment or materials that might be useful for Markham's research. This collaborative aspect of the response to Markham's story represented something unique in the history of scientific research. Never before had an individual investigator been able to reach such a large and technically knowledgeable audience so directly, or to receive such immediate and substantial support for unconventional research projects. The combination of Bell's massive radio audience and the emerging internet culture created possibilities for distributed research collaboration that had never existed before. The technical discussions that began to emerge from Markham's coast-to-coast AM appearance also demonstrated the sophisticated level of scientific thinking that characterized much of the show's audience. Rather than simply accepting Markham's claims at face value, many listeners engaged with the theoretical implications of his work, offering alternative explanations for his observations, or suggesting additional experiments that might help clarify what was actually happening. Some listeners with backgrounds in physics pointed out that certain aspects of Markham's descriptions were consistent with theoretical predictions about electromagnetic field interactions that had never been experimentally verified. Others noted similarities between his reported effects and phenomena that had been observed in other high-energy physics experiments, though never with the consistency or controllability that Markham claimed to have achieved. These technical discussions elevated the conversation about Markham's work far above the level of typical paranormal speculation. Instead of simply debating whether his claims were true or false, listeners were engaging with the scientific principles that might explain his observations and exploring the broader implications of his work for our understanding of fundamental physics. The enthusiasm and support that Markham received from the coast-to-coast AM audience also created new pressures and expectations that he had never faced before. Having captured the attention of millions of listeners with his initial claims, he now felt obligated to continue his research and to provide updates on his progress. The private pursuit of scientific curiosity had become a public performance, with an eager audience waiting for the next development. This transformation from private researcher to public figure was not entirely comfortable for Markham, who had never sought fame or attention for its own sake. His original motivation had been simple scientific curiosity combined with the practical goal of potentially developing technology that might have commercial applications. Now he found himself cast in the role of a pioneering inventor, whose work might revolutionize human understanding of space and time. The financial support that began flowing in from listeners did allow Markham to plan more ambitious experiments than had ever been possible before. Instead of being limited to equipment he could afford on his modest income or was willing to steal from local utilities, he now had access to resources that could support serious scientific investigation. This financial freedom came with its own responsibilities, however, as supporters expected to see tangible progress in exchange for their contributions. Markham's promise during his first Coast to Coast AM appearance that he would continue his research using only legally obtained equipment also created constraints that hadn't existed during his earlier work. While the moral and legal clarity of this approach was obviously preferable, it also meant that he would need to invest considerable time and money in acquiring proper equipment through conventional channels. The weeks and months following Markham's first radio appearance were filled with intense activity as he worked to fulfill the promises he had made on the air. Using funds and equipment donated by listeners, he began constructing a new, more sophisticated version of his experimental apparatus. This second-generation device was designed to operate at much higher power levels than his original Jacob's Ladder modification, with the goal of producing effects large and stable enough to allow for systematic study and documentation. The technical challenges involved in scaling up his experiments were considerable. Working with higher power levels required more robust electrical systems, better safety precautions, and more sophisticated control mechanisms. The theoretical framework that had guided his initial experiments also needed to be refined and expanded to account for the more complex phenomena that he expected to observe with the enhanced apparatus. During this development period, Markham maintained contact with the Coast to Coast AM audience through occasional follow-up calls to the show. These brief appearances allowed him to update listeners on his progress, discuss technical challenges he was encountering, and thank supporters for their continued assistance. Each update generated renewed interest and discussion among the show's audience, keeping Markham's story alive in the public consciousness. The anticipation surrounding Markham's next major appearance on Coast to Coast AM grew steadily throughout 1995 and into 1996. Listeners who had supported his research were eager to hear about the results of the more powerful experiments he had promised. Skeptics were curious to see whether his enhanced apparatus would produce effects that were more convincing than his initial claims. And Bell himself was interested in following up on one of the most compelling stories that had ever emerged from his program. When Markham finally returned to Coast AM in 1996 for his second and final major appearance, the context was dramatically different from his first call the previous year. He was no longer an unknown amateur experimenter calling in to share preliminary observations. Instead, he had become something of a celebrity within the paranormal research community, with supporters around the world following his progress and waiting for updates on his work. This second appearance was also more formally structured than his initial call. Rather than simply phoning in during open phone lines, Markham was invited as a featured guest for an extended interview that would allow him to describe his enhanced experiments in detail and discuss his plans for the future. The promotional build-up to this appearance generated considerable excitement among regular Coast to Coast AM listeners. During the 1996 interview, Markham reported that his enhanced apparatus had indeed produced effects that were dramatically more impressive than anything he had achieved during his initial experiments. The circular distortion phenomenon had grown large enough to accommodate objects the size of small animals, and the spatial displacement effects had become both more pronounced and more controllable. Most significantly, Markham announced that his new device had reached the point where it could potentially accommodate a human subject. The electromagnetic vortex that his apparatus generated was now large enough for a person to step through, opening up the possibility of conducting the ultimate test of his time travel theories by experimenting on himself. This announcement represented both the culmination of Markham's research program and the beginning of an entirely new phase of investigation. If his apparatus could indeed transport objects through space and time as he claimed, then human experimentation would be the logical next step. But it would also represent a level of risk and commitment that went far beyond anything he had previously attempted. The prospect of Markham using himself as a test subject generated intense discussion among Coast to Coast AM listeners. Some supporters encouraged him to proceed with human trials, arguing that only such a dramatic demonstration could convince skeptics and advance scientific understanding. Others urged caution, pointing out the unknown risks involved in subjecting a human being to the electromagnetic fields and spatial distortions that his apparatus generated. Markham himself seemed to recognize both the potential benefits and the dangers of human experimentation. During his 1996 appearance, He spoke thoughtfully about the ethical and practical considerations involved in testing his device on himself. He acknowledged that the risks were significant and largely unknown, but he also expressed his conviction that human trials represented the only way to definitively prove or disprove his theories. The interview concluded with Markham stating that he was approximately 30 days away from completing the final preparations necessary for human experimentation. This timeline created a sense of urgency and anticipation that kept listeners engaged long after the broadcast ended. Many supporters began counting down the days until Markham would presumably conduct the experiment that would either vindicate his claims or expose them as an elaborate self-deception. The 30-day timeline that Markham announced during his final Coast to Coast AM appearance would prove to be prophetic, though not in the way that anyone expected. As the days passed without any word from the young inventor, initial excitement gradually gave way to concern and eventually to mystery. The man who had promised to conduct the ultimate test of time travel had himself disappeared into the unknown. The impact of Markham's Coast to Coast AM appearances extended far beyond their immediate entertainment value or their contribution to paranormal folklore. His story had demonstrated the power of late-night radio to connect unconventional researchers with supportive communities and to facilitate forms of distributed scientific investigation that had never been possible before. More importantly, Markham's appearances had raised fundamental questions about the nature of scientific discovery and the role of amateur researchers in pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. His claims might ultimately prove to be unfounded, but his approach to investigation, methodical, honest, and open to collaboration, represented a model for how unconventional research might be conducted in an age of global communication. The mysterious circumstances surrounding Markham's disappearance would ensure that his story continued to fascinate new generations of listeners long after his final radio appearance. But the real legacy of his Coast to Coast AM calls lay in what they revealed about the hunger for scientific discovery that exists within the general public and the potential for innovative approaches to research that transcend traditional institutional boundaries. The emergence of Mike Markham's story into the public consciousness through Coast to Coast AM created something far more complex than a simple tale of scientific discovery or paranormal claims. Instead, his account became a kind of cultural touchstone that revealed deep divisions in how people approach the boundaries between the possible and the impossible, between established science and speculative investigation, between rational skepticism and open-minded curiosity. The emergence of Mike Markham's story into the public consciousness through Coast to Coast AM created something far more complex than a simple tale of scientific discovery or paranormal claims. Instead, his account became a kind of cultural touchstone that revealed deep divisions in how people approach the boundaries between the possible and the impossible, between established science and speculative investigation, between rational skepticism and open-minded curiosity. From the moment of Markham's first radio appearance, listeners found themselves drawn into camps that reflected their fundamental worldviews and epistemological assumptions. The response was not simply a matter of people deciding whether or not they believed his specific claims about time travel. Instead, his story became a lens through which broader questions about the nature of knowledge, the reliability of institutions, and the possibility of individual breakthrough discovery could be examined and debated. Those who embraced Markham's account did so for reasons that went far beyond the technical details of his experiments or the plausibility of his theoretical framework. For many supporters, his story represented proof that extraordinary discoveries were still possible outside the constraints of official academia and government-funded research programs. Here was a young man working alone in rural Missouri who might have achieved what teams of professional scientists with unlimited resources had failed to accomplish. The appeal of this narrative tapped into deep currents in American culture that have always celebrated individual innovation and been suspicious of institutional authority. From the mythology surrounding inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, to more recent stories of garage-based entrepreneurs revolutionizing entire industries, the figure of the lone genius making breakthrough discoveries has always captured the public imagination. Markham's story fit perfectly into this archetypal pattern. He was young, self-taught, and working outside established institutions. His research was funded not by corporate sponsors or government grants, but by his own ingenuity and the voluntary contributions of ordinary people who believed in his work. his approach to scientific investigation emphasized hands-on experimentation over theoretical analysis, practical results over academic publications. For supporters who were themselves interested in unconventional research or who had experienced phenomena that mainstream science couldn't explain, Markham represented validation of their own beliefs and experiences. If time travel was indeed possible, then many other supposedly impossible things might also be achievable. If one amateur researcher could make such a fundamental breakthrough, then the scientific establishment's claims about what was and wasn't possible might be far more limited than generally assumed. The technical competence that Markham demonstrated in his radio appearances also provided important support for believers who might otherwise have dismissed his claims as fantasy. His detailed descriptions of electrical equipment, his acknowledgement of experimental limitations, and his methodical approach to testing and documentation all suggested someone who was conducting genuine scientific investigation rather than simply making up stories. However, this same technical competence created challenges for those who wanted to evaluate his claims critically. Most people lack the specialized knowledge necessary to assess whether Markham's experimental procedures were sound or whether his theoretical interpretations of observed phenomena were reasonable. This created a situation where belief or disbelief often had to be based on impressions of Markham's credibility rather than on independent evaluation of his evidence. The skeptical response to Markham's story was equally complex and multifaceted. Some skeptics focused on the extraordinary nature of his claims, pointing out that time travel remained purely theoretical, even among professional physicists, and that the energy requirements for any realistic form of temporal manipulation would be astronomically beyond what any individual could achieve with improvised equipment. Others questioned the reliability of Markham's observations, suggesting that the effects he described could be explained by conventional electromagnetic phenomena that he had misinterpreted or misunderstood. High-voltage electrical equipment can indeed produce dramatic visual effects, electromagnetic interference, and other phenomena that might appear anomalous to observers who are not familiar with their normal operating characteristics. The lack of independent verification also provided grounds for skeptical evaluation. Despite the technical sophistication of Markham's descriptions and the consistency of his accounts, no other researcher had successfully replicated his experiments or confirmed his observations. In the scientific community, reproducibility is considered essential for validating extraordinary claims, and Markham's work had not met this standard. More fundamentally, some skeptics questioned whether Markham's story represented genuine scientific investigation at all, or whether it was better understood as an elaborate form of performance art or attention-seeking behavior. The dramatic nature of his claims, the perfect timing of his media appearances, and the convenient way that his story unfolded through a series of increasingly ambitious experiments all suggested the possibility of deliberate construction rather than authentic discovery. This skeptical perspective was reinforced by the broader context of paranormal claims that regularly appeared on shows like Coast to Coast AM. For every story that might contain genuine anomalous phenomena, there were dozens that were clearly based on misinterpretation, self-deception, or outright fabrication. Given this background, extraordinary claims like Markham's required extraordinary evidence to be taken seriously by careful observers. The psychological aspects of belief and skepticism also played important roles in how different people responded to Markham's story. Research in cognitive psychology has shown that people have strong tendencies to interpret ambiguous information in ways that confirm their existing beliefs and expectations. Those who were predisposed to believe in the possibility of paranormal phenomena were likely to interpret Markham's accounts as evidence supporting their worldview, while those who were skeptical of such claims were likely to focus on aspects of his story that suggested conventional explanations. The social dynamics surrounding Markham's story also influenced how different groups responded to his claims. Within the Coast to Coast AM community, supporting Markham became a way of demonstrating membership in a group that valued open-mindedness and unconventional thinking. Questioning his claims too aggressively might be seen as betraying the community's values and adopting the closed-minded attitude that characterized mainstream academia and government institutions. As Markham's story spread beyond the immediate Coast to Coast AM audience through word of mouth, internet forums, and other media coverage, it began to take on mythological dimensions that went far beyond the original technical claims. Details of his experiments became embellished or distorted through repeated retellings, and additional elements were sometimes added that had no basis in Markham's own accounts. One of the most persistent additions to the Markham mythology was the story of a couch that allegedly disappeared from his home during one of his experiments. According to this version of events, Markham and his friends were socializing when someone asked for a beer. When Markham returned with the drink, the couch on which his friend had been sitting had completely vanished, with no obvious explanation for how such a large piece of furniture could have been removed from the room. While Markham himself did mention this incident during one of his later radio appearances, he was careful to emphasize that he wasn't certain whether the couch's disappearance was related to his time travel experiments or might have had some more conventional explanation. In the mythologized versions of the story, however, this uncertainty was often omitted, and the couch incident became presented as definitive proof of Markham's time manipulation capabilities. Similar mythological elaborations occurred with other aspects of Markham's story. The specific details of his experimental apparatus became increasingly elaborate and sophisticated in later retellings. The effects he observed were described in more dramatic terms than he had originally used, and the implications of his work were expanded to encompass broader theories about government cover-ups, secret research programs, and hidden scientific knowledge. The mythologization of Markham's story reflected broader patterns in how extraordinary claims evolve as they spread through various communities and media channels. Like a game of telephone played across multiple platforms and audiences, each retelling of the story provided opportunities for details to be modified, enhanced, or reinterpreted according to the interests and beliefs of the people sharing it. This process of mythological evolution was accelerated by the emergence of internet forums and early web communities, where Markham's story could be discussed, analysed, and elaborated upon by people who had never heard his original radio appearances. These online discussions often focused more on the implications and possibilities suggested by his work, rather than on careful evaluation of his actual claims and evidence. The internet also provided a platform for connecting Markham's story with other accounts of time travel, electromagnetic anomalies, and government research programs. Users began drawing connections between his experiments and various conspiracy theories, alleged secret projects, and other paranormal claims that might provide broader context for understanding his work. Some online discussions attempted to place Markham's research within the framework of established physics theories, exploring connections to concepts like wormholes, dimensional folding, and quantum mechanics. While these theoretical discussions often demonstrated sophisticated understanding of advanced physics concepts, they also sometimes ventured into speculative territory that went far beyond what Markham himself had ever claimed or proposed. The psychological appeal of time travel as a concept also contributed to the mythological elaboration of Markham's story. Time travel represents one of humanity's most persistent fantasies, offering the possibility of correcting past mistakes, preventing tragedies, or gaining knowledge about future events. For people who were dissatisfied with their present circumstances, or who harboured regrets about past decisions, the idea that time travel might actually be possible provided hope and excitement that transcended rational evaluation of evidence. The specific way that Markham described his time travel mechanism also had psychological appeal that went beyond its technical plausibility. Unlike the elaborate machines described in science fiction stories, his apparatus was supposedly constructed from readily available components, using techniques that any skilled amateur could potentially master. This accessibility made time travel seem achievable, rather than forever confined to the realm of imagination and professional research. The collaborative aspect of Markham's research, with ordinary people contributing funds and equipment to support his work, also created a sense of shared ownership and investment in his success. Supporters weren't just passive observers of his experiments, they were active participants who had made personal contributions to advancing his research. This involvement created psychological incentives to believe in the legitimacy of his work that went beyond objective evaluation of evidence. The mystery surrounding Markham's ultimate disappearance added another layer of mythological appeal to his story. Rather than concluding with definitive proof or disproof of his claims, his narrative ended with unanswered questions that allowed people to continue speculating about what might have happened and whether his experiments had ultimately succeeded. The cultural impact of Markham's story also reflected broader anxieties about the pace of technological change and the increasing complexity of modern scientific research. For many people, the highly specialized nature of contemporary science had made it impossible to understand or evaluate the work being done by professional researchers. Claims like Markham's offered the appealing possibility that important discoveries might still be made by individuals working with comprehensible technology and straightforward experimental methods. The timing of Markham's emergence in the mid-1990s also coincided with growing public awareness of various government research programs that had previously been classified or hidden from public view. Revelations about projects like MKUltra, the Manhattan Project, and various military research initiatives had created suspicion that official institutions might be withholding important scientific discoveries for political or strategic reasons. In this context, Markham's work represented the possibility that crucial breakthroughs might be achieved by independent researchers who were not bound by government secrecy requirements or institutional constraints. His willingness to share his discoveries publicly through radio appearances and to accept support from ordinary citizens created a model for democratic science that contrasted sharply with secretive government programs. The international dimension of Coast to Coast AM's audience also meant that Markham's story reached people in many different countries and cultural contexts. The universal appeal of time travel as a concept, combined with widespread curiosity about American scientific and technological capabilities, helped his story spread far beyond its original context and audience. As the years passed without any resolution to the mystery of Markham's disappearance, his story continued to evolve and branch into multiple versions that served different communities and purposes. Some focused on the technical aspects of his research and attempted to reverse engineer his experimental procedures. Others emphasized the conspiracy theory aspects of his case and speculated about government involvement in his disappearance. Still other versions of the story treated Markham as a kind of folk hero who represented the triumph of individual curiosity over institutional limitations. In these accounts, the specific details of his experiments became less important than what he symbolized about the potential for ordinary people to make extraordinary discoveries. The persistence of interest in Markham's story across multiple decades and technological platforms demonstrated the enduring power of narratives that combine scientific speculation with mystery and human drama. His case became a template for how extraordinary claims could capture public attention and generate lasting cultural impact, even in the absence of definitive evidence or resolution. The division between believers and skeptics that characterized the initial response to Markham's story also proved to be remarkably durable. Despite the passage of time and the lack of new evidence, people continue to line up on different sides of debates about the legitimacy of his claims and the significance of his disappearance. This persistence suggested that responses to stories like Markham's are based on fundamental worldview differences that are not easily changed by additional information or analysis. The questions raised by his case about the nature of scientific authority, the possibility of individual breakthrough discovery, and the boundaries between the possible and the impossible remain as relevant today as they were when he first called into Coast to Coast AM. The winter of 1997 arrived in Missouri with the kind of bitter cold that settles deep into the bones and transforms the landscape into something austere and unforgiving. Snow covered the fields around Stanbury, and the bare branches of oak and maple trees stood like dark sketches against the grey sky. It was during this season of dormancy and waiting that Mike Markham, the young man who had captivated the imagination of millions with his claims about time travel, began to fade from public view in a manner that would ultimately prove more mysterious than any of his experimental results. The timeline leading up to Markham's disappearance is marked by a series of increasingly urgent communications and dwindling contact with the outside world. Following his final major appearance on Coast to Coast AM in 1996, when he had announced that he was 30 days away from completing his human-scale time machine, Markham had maintained sporadic contact with some of the supporters who had helped fund his research. These communications, mostly through phone calls and occasional letters, suggested that his work was progressing but facing unexpected technical challenges. Those who spoke with Markham during this period described a young man who seemed increasingly focused on his experiments to the exclusion of almost everything else in his life. The collaborative enthusiasm that had characterized his earlier interactions with supporters had given way to a more solitary and obsessive approach to his research. He spoke less about theoretical frameworks and more about immediate practical problems, power supply issues, equipment failures, and the physical demands of working with increasingly dangerous levels of electrical energy. The isolation that marked Markham's final months was both physical and psychological. Having moved away from his original location in Stanbury, to avoid the curious visitors and media attention that his coast-to-coast AM appearances had generated, he had established his new laboratory in a more remote location that provided the privacy necessary for his experiments, but also cut him off from the informal support networks that had sustained him during his earlier work. This new laboratory, according to accounts from the few people who visited it, was a far more sophisticated and dangerous operation than his original backyard setup. Using funds and equipment provided by supporters, Markham had constructed an apparatus that operated at power levels that dwarfed anything he had previously attempted. The electrical demands of his experiments were so substantial that he had been forced to make special arrangements with local utility companies and to install additional safety equipment to prevent the kind of widespread power outages that had brought him to official attention in 1995. The scale and complexity of this enhanced apparatus also meant that Markham was now working alone with equipment that would have challenged even experienced electrical engineers. The safety protocols necessary for such work were elaborate and time-consuming, requiring constant vigilance and multiple backup systems to prevent catastrophic accidents. For someone who had always preferred hands-on experimentation to theoretical planning, these requirements created frustrations that began to affect both his research progress and his psychological well-being. Friends and supporters who maintained contact with Markham during this period noticed changes in his personality and communication style that suggested someone under tremendous pressure. The enthusiastic young inventor who had eagerly shared his discoveries and speculations during his radio appearances had become more secretive and guarded, often declining to discuss specific details of his ongoing work or his timeline for completion. The financial pressures associated with his research had also intensified considerably. While the initial outpouring of support from coast-to-coast AM listeners had provided substantial funding for equipment and materials, the cost associated with his enhanced experiments far exceeded what voluntary donations could sustain. Electricity bills alone for his high-power experiments ran into thousands of dollars per month, and the specialized equipment required for his work carried price tags that would have challenged well-funded research institutions. These financial constraints meant that Markham was often forced to choose between maintaining his experimental program and meeting basic living expenses. Some supporters continued to send contributions, but the initial enthusiasm that had generated substantial funding was difficult to maintain without regular updates on research progress or tangible demonstrations of success. The pressure to produce results that would justify the support he'd received also created a psychological burden that Markham seemed increasingly unable to manage. Having become a public figure based on his claims about breakthrough scientific discoveries, he faced expectations from supporters, skeptics, and the media that demanded either conclusive proof of his theories or acknowledgement that his work had failed to achieve its ambitious goals. The perfectionist tendencies that had driven Markham's meticulous approach to experimental documentation now worked against him as he struggled to achieve results that met his own extremely high standards. Rather than sharing preliminary findings or partial successes that might have maintained public interest and continued support, he appeared to be holding back until he could present completely definitive proof of time travel capabilities. During the final months of 1996 and early 1997, several people who had maintained contact with Markham reported conversations in which he spoke about being close to a major breakthrough that would vindicate all of his previous work and justify the risks and sacrifices involved in his research program. These accounts, while lacking specific technical details, suggested that he believed his enhanced apparatus was finally producing the kind of large-scale, stable effects that would allow for human experimentation. The prospect of Markham actually attempting to use himself as a test subject for his time travel device created considerable anxiety among some of his supporters. While they wanted his research to succeed, they also recognized the enormous risks involved in subjecting a human being to the kinds of electromagnetic fields and spatial distortions that his apparatus allegedly generated. Several people attempted to convince him to conduct additional safety testing, or to find volunteers who might be willing to participate in human trials, but Markham seemed determined to conduct the ultimate test himself. This determination reflected both his scientific dedication and his growing isolation from outside perspectives that might have provided more cautious counsel. Having worked alone for so long with equipment and phenomena that no one else fully understood, Markham had developed a level of confidence in his apparatus and his ability to control its effects that may have exceeded what the actual safety margins warranted. The specific circumstances surrounding Markham's final communications with the outside world remain somewhat unclear, partly because different people received different messages, and partly because the significance of these communications only became apparent after his disappearance was discovered. Some supporters reported receiving phone calls in which Markham spoke excitedly about imminent breakthroughs and asked for prayers or good wishes for upcoming experiments. Others received more cryptic messages that suggested Markham was preparing for something significant, but was reluctant to discuss specifics. These communications had a quality of finality that some recipients found troubling, though the full implications only became clear in retrospect. Several people later reported feeling that Markham was saying goodbye, though he never explicitly indicated that he was planning anything that might prevent future contact. The last confirmed communication from Markham appears to have occurred in late January or early February of 1997, though the exact date remains uncertain because different sources provide conflicting information. What seems clear is that by March of 1997, people who'd been in regular contact with him began to notice that their phone calls were going unanswered and their letters were being returned by the postal service. Initial attempts to contact Markham were not immediately alarming, since he had always been somewhat unpredictable in his communication patterns, and had often gone for weeks without responding to messages when he was deeply focused on experimental work. However, as the weeks stretched into months without any word from him, concern began to grow among the network of supporters who had been following his research. The first serious attempts to locate Markham physically were undertaken by supporters who lived in Missouri and could travel to his last known location. What they found was deeply unsettling: an abandoned laboratory containing sophisticated electrical equipment, but no sign of Markham himself or any indication of what might have happened to him. The condition of the abandoned laboratory provided tantalizing but inconclusive clues about Markham's final activities. Some equipment appeared to have been left in mid-experiment, with control settings and connections that suggested recent use. However, other systems had been carefully shut down and secured in ways that indicated deliberate preparation for extended absence, rather than sudden departure. Most mysterious was the absence of Markham's experimental logs and documentation, which had always been a central part of his research methodology. These materials, which would have provided crucial information about his final experiments and their results, were nowhere to be found. Whether they had been removed by Markham himself, confiscated by authorities, or destroyed in some experimental accident remained completely unclear. The electrical meter readings for the laboratory showed massive power consumption that had continued for several days after Markham's last confirmed communication, suggesting that his apparatus had been operating at high power levels even after he had stopped responding to outside contact. However, the power consumption had then dropped to normal background levels, indicating that the experiments had either concluded successfully or been terminated for other reasons. Local utility company records confirmed that there had been no unusual power outages or electrical problems in the area during the time period when Markham presumably disappeared. This suggested that if his final experiments had gone catastrophically wrong, they had not caused the kind of widespread electrical disruption that had characterized some of his earlier work. The response of local law enforcement to reports of Markham's disappearance was complicated by the unusual circumstances of his case and his previous interactions with police. Having been arrested in 1995 for the transformer theft that had first brought his experiments to public attention, Markham was known to local authorities as someone whose activities sometimes operated outside legal boundaries. When concerned supporters contacted the Gentry County Sheriff's Department to report Markham's disappearance, they encountered a law enforcement system that was uncertain about how to classify his case. Unlike typical missing person situations, there was no clear evidence of foul play, no ransom demands or threatening communications, and no obvious personal or financial crises that might have motivated Markham to disappear voluntarily. The Missouri State Highway Patrol, which maintains records of missing person reports throughout the state, has no official record of Markham being reported as missing. This administrative gap reflects the ambiguous nature of his disappearance, and the difficulty that family members, friends, and supporters faced in navigating the formal processes for reporting missing persons when the circumstances were so unusual. The lack of official missing person status also meant that Markham's case did not receive the kind of systematic investigation that might have been applied to more conventional disappearances. Without clear evidence of criminal activity or immediate danger to public safety, law enforcement agencies had limited resources to dedicate to investigating what might have been a voluntary disappearance by an adult who had chosen to withdraw from public contact. The absence of family members who were actively pursuing official investigation also contributed to the administrative limbo surrounding Markham's disappearance. Unlike cases where concerned relatives maintained pressure on law enforcement agencies and media outlets, Markham's case was primarily advocated for by supporters and fellow researchers who lacked the legal standing and emotional authority that family members would have possessed. This situation created a vacuum in which speculation and rumour could flourish without being constrained by official investigation or authoritative information. The mystery of what had happened to Markham became a kind of collective puzzle that engaged the imagination of coast-to-coast AM listeners, internet forum participants, and amateur investigators who had followed his story from the beginning. Some of the early theories about Markham's disappearance focused on the possibility that his time travel experiments had succeeded, and that he had voluntarily transported himself to another time period. Proponents of this theory pointed to his statements about being close to conducting human trials, and suggested that his disappearance was actually proof that his apparatus had worked exactly as intended. Other theories proposed that Markham had suffered an accident during his final experiments that had either killed him or transported him to a location or time from which he could not return. These scenarios suggested that while his time travel theories might have been correct, the practical implementation had gone disastrously wrong in ways that made rescue or return impossible. More prosaic explanations focused on the possibility that Markham had chosen to disappear voluntarily to escape the pressures and expectations that had accumulated around his research. According to this theory, the burden of maintaining his public persona while conducting increasingly dangerous experiments had become unbearable, leading him to abandon his work and start a new life under a different identity. Some supporters speculated that Markham's disappearance might have been involuntary but conventional in nature, that he had been kidnapped, killed, or otherwise harmed by people who opposed his research or wanted to steal his discoveries. These theories often involve speculation about government agencies or corporate interests that might have had reasons to suppress time travel research. The international nature of interest in Markham's case also generated theories that he had been recruited by foreign governments or research institutions that could provide better funding and security for his work. According to these accounts, his disappearance was actually a carefully planned extraction that allowed him to continue his research in a more suitable environment. As months turned to years without any credible sightings or communications from Markham, the mystery of his disappearance took on mythological dimensions that transcended the original circumstances of his case. His story became a kind of modern legend that illustrated both the possibilities and the perils of pushing beyond the boundaries of accepted knowledge. The enduring mystery surrounding Markham's disappearance also highlighted the unique challenges faced by amateur researchers working in controversial areas of investigation. Unlike professional scientists whose work is conducted within institutional frameworks that provide safety oversight, peer review, and emergency support, independent researchers like Markham operated in isolation that could become dangerous when dealing with experimental technologies and unexplored phenomena. The absence of any definitive resolution to Markham's case has allowed it to serve multiple symbolic functions for different communities and audiences. For believers in the possibility of breakthrough scientific discoveries by amateur researchers, his story represents both inspiration and cautionary tale about the risks involved in pursuing revolutionary research outside established institutions. For skeptics who questioned the legitimacy of his claims from the beginning, his disappearance provides additional reason to doubt the entire narrative and to view the whole episode as an elaborate hoax that was concluded when maintaining the deception became too difficult or dangerous. The persistence of interest in Markham's case across multiple decades demonstrates the enduring power of mysteries that combine scientific speculation with human drama and unresolved questions. His disappearance transformed him from a controversial figure making extraordinary claims into a symbol of the eternal human quest to transcend the limitations of existence and explore the ultimate mysteries of space and time. In the years following Mike Markham's mysterious disappearance, his story began to take on a life of its own, spreading through various media channels and evolving with each retelling in ways that both preserved and transformed the essential elements of his remarkable tale. What had begun as a series of radio interviews on Coast to Coast AM gradually expanded into a multi-platform narrative that would reach new audiences across different generations and technological landscapes. The initial media coverage of Markham's disappearance was surprisingly limited, reflecting both the unconventional nature of his story and the challenge that mainstream outlets faced in deciding how to approach a case that straddled the boundary between legitimate news and paranormal speculation. Local newspapers in Missouri had covered his original arrest for transformer theft in 1995, but by the time his disappearance became apparent, he was no longer a primarily local story. Instead, he had become a figure whose significance existed mainly within the specialized communities that followed paranormal research and alternative science. Art Bell himself played a crucial role in keeping Markham's story alive during the immediate aftermath of his disappearance. As months passed without any word from the young inventor, Bell began mentioning his case during broadcasts, asking listeners if anyone had information about what might have happened to him. These appeals transformed Coast to Coast AM from simply the platform where Markham had gained fame into an active investigative forum where theories about his fate could be proposed and discussed. The unique relationship between Bell and his audience created an environment where Markham's disappearance became a shared mystery, rather than simply a news story to be reported and forgotten. Listeners who had supported his research felt personally invested in discovering what had happened to him. They had contributed money, equipment, and encouragement to his work, creating emotional bonds that transcended typical audience engagement with media content. This personal investment manifested in various forms of amateur investigation and speculation that kept Markham's case visible within the Coast to Coast AM community long after mainstream media attention had faded. Listeners shared theories about his disappearance, reported alleged sightings, and continued to discuss the technical aspects of his research years after his final radio appearance. The absence of definitive information about what had happened to Markham created a vacuum that different people filled with narratives that reflected their own interests and beliefs. Some focused on the scientific implications of his work and speculated about whether his experiments had achieved breakthrough results that were being suppressed or exploited by government agencies or corporate interests. Others emphasized the human drama of his story, portraying him as a tragic figure whose pursuit of scientific truth had led to his destruction or disappearance. These accounts often highlighted the isolation and pressure that had characterized his final months, suggesting that his fate served as a cautionary tale about the personal costs of pursuing revolutionary research without institutional support or oversight. The emergence of the Internet as a significant media platform during the late 1990s and early 2000s provided new opportunities for Markham's story to reach broader audiences and evolve through collaborative storytelling. Early web forums and discussion boards became gathering places where people could share information, theories, and speculation about his case without the editorial constraints that characterized traditional media outlets. These online discussions often went into far greater technical detail than had been possible during his original radio appearances. Participants with backgrounds in physics, electrical engineering, and related fields could analyze his experimental descriptions and theoretical framework with a level of sophistication that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his approach to time travel research. The Internet also made it possible for people to conduct independent research into various aspects of Markham's story, tracking down official records, newspaper articles, and other documentation that provided context for his claims and circumstances. This collaborative fact-checking sometimes revealed inconsistencies or gaps in the publicly available information about his case, but it also confirmed many of the basic details of his story. Some online investigators attempted to locate Markham himself, using various internet search tools and databases to look for any traces of his continued existence. These efforts occasionally produced leads that generated excitement within the community, but none ever resulted in definitive proof that he had survived his disappearance or was living under a different identity. The persistence of interest in Markham's case within online communities also attracted the attention of writers, researchers, and media producers who saw his story as material for books, documentaries, and other projects. However, the challenge of verifying details about his life and work, combined with the lack of cooperation from family members or official sources, made it difficult to produce comprehensive accounts that met traditional journalistic standards. Some authors chose to focus on Markham's case as part of broader examinations of amateur scientific research, time travel claims, or the cultural impact of paranormal radio programming. These treatments typically placed his story within larger contexts that helped explain its significance, while acknowledging the limitations of available evidence about specific details of his life and work. The international reach of coast-to-coast AM and early internet communities meant that Markham's story also gained attention in countries outside the United States. Forums and websites in various languages discussed his experiments and disappearance, often incorporating cultural perspectives and theoretical frameworks that differed from those prevalent in American discussions of his case. This international interest sometimes led to claims that Markham had been spotted in various foreign locations, or that his research was being continued by scientists in other countries. While none of these reports proved credible upon investigation, they demonstrated the global appeal of his story and the widespread fascination with the possibility that amateur researchers might achieve breakthrough discoveries in fundamental physics. One of the most significant developments in the ongoing coverage of Markham's story occurred in 2015, when Art Bell returned to radio broadcasting with a new program called Midnight in the Desert. During one of the early episodes of this new show, Bell featured an audio recording that purported to be a recent interview with Mike Markham himself, conducted years after his supposed disappearance. In this recording, a voice claiming to be Markham described what had allegedly happened during his final experiments in 1997. According to this account, his time travel apparatus had indeed functioned as intended, but rather than allowing him to travel voluntarily to a chosen destination, it had transported him involuntarily to a different time and location. The voice claimed that he had found himself approximately 800 miles away from his Missouri laboratory and roughly 2 years in the future, with no memory of how the transportation had occurred. The mysterious caller described a period of amnesia and confusion following his alleged time travel experience, during which he had lived as a homeless person, while gradually recovering his identity and memories. According to his account, the electromagnetic effects of his apparatus had caused neurological damage that had taken years to heal, explaining his long absence from public contact. This purported interview generated enormous excitement and controversy within the communities that had followed Markham's story over the years. Supporters argued that the voice sounded authentic and that the technical details provided in the interview were consistent with Markham's known experimental work. They viewed the recording as vindication of their belief that his time travel research had succeeded, and that his disappearance had been the result of successful experimentation rather than accident or voluntary withdrawal. However, skeptics questioned the authenticity of the recording and pointed out various inconsistencies between the caller's account and previously established details about Markham's life and work. The long delay between his disappearance and this alleged recontact raised questions about why he had not attempted to communicate with supporters or investigators earlier, particularly given his previous willingness to share information about his research publicly. The technical quality of the recording also made it difficult to verify the identity of the speaker through voice analysis or other forensic methods. Without corroborating evidence such as current photographs, documentation, or personal details that could not have been known by someone impersonating Markham, the interview remained subject to interpretation based on listeners' pre-existing beliefs about his case. The controversy surrounding the 2015 interview highlighted how Markham's story had evolved over the years, from a contemporary mystery into a kind of legend that could accommodate multiple interpretations and conclusions. Different people could listen to the same recording and reach completely different conclusions about its authenticity, based on their theoretical frameworks for understanding his original claims and disappearance. The interview also demonstrated how advances in technology and changes in media landscape had created new possibilities for both authentic communication and sophisticated hoaxes. The ease with which audio could be manipulated and distributed through digital platforms meant that any purported evidence about Markham's fate would face higher skeptical standards than might have been applied to similar claims in earlier decades. Beyond the specific question of the 2015 interview's authenticity, the broader pattern of media coverage and discussion surrounding Markham's case revealed important insights about how extraordinary claims evolve and persist in popular culture. His story had managed to maintain relevance and generate new interest across multiple decades and technological platforms, suggesting that it addressed fundamental human concerns that transcended the specific details of time travel research. The various retellings of his story in different media formats, radio shows, internet forums, books, podcasts, and video content, had each emphasized different aspects of his case and reached different audiences with varying levels of technical knowledge and theoretical sophistication. This diversity of presentation had helped ensure that his story remained accessible to new generations of people interested in paranormal phenomena, alternative science, or unsolved mysteries. The academic study of how stories like Markham spread and evolved through various media channels also began to attract attention from researchers interested in folklore, urban legends, and the sociology of belief. His case provided a relatively well-documented example of how contemporary legends emerge and develop, offering insights into the factors that determine which extraordinary claims achieve lasting cultural significance. Some scholars noted parallels between Markham's story and historical accounts of inventors, scientists, and explorers whose work had initially been dismissed or suppressed before eventually being recognized as legitimate. These comparisons suggested that contemporary skepticism about his claims might be similar to the resistance that many genuine breakthrough discoveries had faced in the past. Others focused on the psychological and social functions that stories like Markham's serve in cultures that are experiencing rapid technological change and increasing scientific complexity. His tale offered reassurance that important discoveries might still be made by individuals working outside institutional frameworks, providing hope that ordinary people could still make extraordinary contributions to human knowledge and advancement. The international dimension of interest in Markham's case also reflected broader cultural anxieties about American technological leadership and the possibility that breakthrough discoveries might be made in unexpected places by unconventional researchers. His story embodied both the promise and the peril of amateur scientific investigation in an era when the frontiers of knowledge seemed increasingly accessible to individual exploration. The persistence of new media coverage and discussion about Markham's case also contributed to the ongoing evolution of his story, with each new retelling potentially introducing modifications, elaborations, or reinterpretations that could influence how future audiences understood his work and disappearance. This process of continuous narrative evolution ensured that his story remained dynamic rather than fixed, capable of adapting to changing cultural contexts and technological possibilities. The challenge faced by anyone attempting to investigate or document Markham's case was the difficulty of separating the original facts of his story from the layers of speculation, elaboration, and mythologization that had accumulated over the years. Each new account of his work and disappearance had to navigate between respect for the documented evidence and acknowledgement of the broader cultural significance that his story had acquired. The media coverage of Markham's case also highlighted the unique challenges that face journalists and researchers who attempt to investigate claims that exist at the boundaries between science and speculation. Traditional standards of evidence and verification that work well for conventional news stories proved inadequate for evaluating extraordinary claims that involved theoretical possibilities and experimental results that could not be independently confirmed. This methodological challenge had implications beyond Markham's specific case, raising questions about how media outlets should approach similar stories involving amateur researchers, unconventional scientific claims, or phenomena that challenge established theoretical frameworks. The balance between open-minded investigation and responsible skepticism remained difficult to achieve, particularly when dealing with cases that generated strong emotional responses from both supporters and critics. The long-term media legacy of Markham's story also demonstrated the power of narrative coherence and human drama to sustain public interest even in the absence of new factual developments. His case had all the elements that make stories memorable and compelling: a young protagonist pursuing an impossible dream, dramatic claims about revolutionary discoveries, mysterious circumstances surrounding his disappearance, and ongoing speculation about his ultimate fate. These narrative elements ensured that Markham's story would continue to find new audiences and generate fresh interest long after the specific details of his experimental work and disappearance had become historical rather than contemporary concerns. His transformation from a real person conducting actual experiments into a legendary figure representing broader themes about human ambition, scientific discovery, and the mysteries of existence seemed likely to continue indefinitely. In the absence of definitive evidence about Mike Markham's fate, human nature has done what it always does when confronted with compelling mysteries. It has generated theories. Over the decades since his disappearance, a rich tapestry of explanations has emerged, ranging from the utterly prosaic to the fantastically impossible, each reflecting the worldview and assumptions of those who propose them. These theories, taken together, reveal as much about our collective hopes, fears, and beliefs about the nature of reality as they do about what might actually have happened to a young inventor in rural Missouri. The most straightforward explanation for Markham's disappearance is also, perhaps, the most difficult for his supporters to accept, that he simply chose to walk away from his public life and start over somewhere else under a different identity. According to this theory, the pressures of fame, the financial burdens of his research, and the mounting expectations from supporters and skeptics alike became unbearable, leading him to stage his own disappearance and begin life anew in anonymity. This voluntary disappearance theory finds support in several aspects of Markham's situation during his final months. The increasing isolation that characterized his later work, the financial strain of maintaining expensive experiments, and the psychological pressure of being the sole advocate for revolutionary scientific claims would have created enormous stress for anyone, but particularly for a young man who had never sought fame or attention for its own sake. The meticulous way in which some of his laboratory equipment had been shut down and secured before his disappearance suggests deliberate preparation rather than sudden departure due to accident or emergency. Someone planning to disappear voluntarily would naturally want to ensure that dangerous electrical equipment was safely deactivated to prevent hazards that might draw unwanted attention or cause injury to others. The absence of his experimental documentation and research notes also supports the voluntary disappearance theory. If Markham had been planning to continue his research in a new location under a different identity, he would naturally have taken his most valuable intellectual property with him. The systematic removal of these materials suggests advanced planning rather than hasty departure. Proponents of this theory argue that Markham's youth and intelligence would have made it relatively easy for him to establish a new identity in the pre-internet era of the mid-1990s. Social security fraud and identity theft were more difficult to detect then than they are today, and someone with technical skills could have found legitimate employment under an assumed name, without triggering the kind of background checks that would be routine today. The theory gains additional credibility from the fact that voluntary disappearances, while uncommon, are not unprecedented. People who find themselves trapped by circumstances, obligations, or expectations they cannot meet sometimes choose to abandon their existing lives rather than face the consequences of their situations. For someone in Markham's position, starting over might have seemed preferable to admitting failure or facing potential ridicule. However, critics of the voluntary disappearance theory point out several aspects of Markham's case that seem inconsistent with this explanation. His genuine enthusiasm for his research and his apparent belief in the importance of his work make it difficult to understand why he would abandon everything just when he claimed to be on the verge of breakthrough results. The collaborative relationships he had developed with supporters who had contributed money and equipment to his research also created moral obligations that seem inconsistent with voluntary abandonment. Markham had consistently demonstrated integrity in his dealings with supporters, making regular progress reports and expressing gratitude for assistance received. Disappearing without explanation would have represented a significant departure from this pattern of responsible communication. More fundamentally, the voluntary disappearance theory requires us to believe that Markham was essentially perpetrating a fraud from the beginning, that his claims about time travel research were elaborate fabrications designed to generate attention and support that he ultimately intended to exploit. This interpretation conflicts with the technical competence and consistency that characterized his public presentations and the genuine experimental work that was documented by law enforcement during his 1995 arrest. A second category of mundane explanations focuses on the possibility that Markham suffered an accident during his final experiments that resulted in his death. High-voltage electrical equipment of the type he was using poses serious risks of electrocution, explosion, and fire, particularly when operated by someone working alone without proper safety oversight. The accident theory is supported by several troubling aspects of Markham's experimental setup and methodology. The power levels at which his enhanced apparatus operated were far beyond what most amateur experimenters would ever attempt, creating dangers that might not have been fully appreciated by someone without formal training in high-voltage electrical safety. Working alone with such dangerous equipment violated basic safety protocols that are followed by professional researchers precisely because accidents can occur with devastating speed. A single mistake in handling high-voltage connections, a momentary lapse in attention, or an unexpected equipment failure could have resulted in fatal injuries that left no time for calling for help or shutting down experimental systems. The continued high-power consumption recorded by electrical meters for several days after Markham's last communication could be explained by automatic systems that continued operating after an accident had incapacitated or killed him. If his apparatus had been designed to run predetermined experimental sequences, it might have continued consuming power and cycling through programmed operations even after the operator was no longer able to supervise or control it. According to some versions of the accident theory, Markham's body might have been completely destroyed by the high-energy processes involved in his experiments, leaving no physical evidence of what had occurred. High-voltage electrical accidents can indeed cause severe burns and tissue damage that might make identification of remains difficult or impossible. Alternative versions of the accident theory suggest that his body might have been disposed of by someone who discovered the scene, but chose to cover up the incident rather than report it to authorities. This could have been motivated by concerns about legal liability, desire to avoid investigation of the experimental activities, or fear that reporting the death might lead to unwanted scrutiny of their own involvement in supporting his research. However, the accident theory faces several challenges when examined against the available evidence. The careful shutdown of some experimental systems suggests that someone had taken time to secure the laboratory after the experiments ended, which would be inconsistent with a sudden fatal accident that left equipment running automatically. The complete absence of any physical evidence of an accident, no burns, explosion damage, or electromagnetic disruption that would typically accompany high-voltage electrical accidents, also raises questions about this explanation. Even if Markham's body had been destroyed or removed, some traces of a catastrophic electrical incident would normally remain visible in the experimental area. Most significantly, the accident theory fails to account for the missing experimental documentation. A sudden accident would not explain why Markham's research notes, experimental logs, and theoretical materials were not found at the scene. These materials were crucial components of his work and would not have been moved or destroyed by an electrical accident. Moving beyond mundane explanations, we encounter theories that embrace the possibility that Markham's extraordinary claims about time travel were accurate, and that his disappearance resulted from successful experimentation rather than failure or voluntary withdrawal. According to these theories, Markham achieved exactly what he had been working toward: functional time travel capability, but the results were not what he had anticipated or intended. The successful time travel theory comes in several variations, each addressing different aspects of what might have gone wrong with an otherwise successful experiment. The most straightforward version proposes that Markham's apparatus worked exactly as designed, transporting him to a different time period from which he chose not to return. According to this interpretation, his disappearance was intentional and successful, representing the culmination of his research rather than its termination. This version of the theory draws support from Markham's own statements during his final radio appearances about being close to conducting human trials of his apparatus. If his calculations and experimental results had convinced him that time travel was not only possible but safe, he might have made the conscious decision to test the system on himself without informing anyone of his intentions. The appeal of this interpretation lies in its treatment of Markham as a successful scientist rather than a victim of accident or circumstance. Rather than viewing his disappearance as tragic or mysterious, this theory presents it as the logical conclusion of successful scientific investigation, the ultimate validation of theories and methods that had been dismissed or ridiculed by conventional academia. However, a more troubling variation of the successful time travel theory suggests that while Markham's apparatus functioned as a transportation device, it did not provide the kind of controlled voluntary travel that he had intended to achieve. Instead, it may have transported him to a time or location from which return was impossible, due to technical limitations, equipment failure, or unforeseen circumstances. This version draws inspiration from science fiction concepts about the dangers and unpredictabilities of time travel, particularly the possibility that temporal transportation might be a one-way process, or that travellers might find themselves trapped in situations where they cannot access the technology necessary to return to their original time and place. The 2015 interview that purported to feature Markham himself supports a variation of this theory, with the caller claiming that his time travel experience had been involuntary and traumatic rather than planned and controlled. According to this account, his apparatus had indeed functioned as a time machine, but the experience had resulted in amnesia, disorientation, and a period of recovery that had prevented him from returning to public contact for many years. Whether authentic or not, this interview addressed one of the logical challenges facing successful time travel theories. If Markham had achieved controllable time travel, why had he not returned to demonstrate his success, or at least communicate with supporters who had helped make his research possible? The involuntary time travel theory provides a potential answer by suggesting that his transportation had been accidental, rather than planned, resulting in circumstances that prevented normal communication or return. The electromagnetic effects that the caller described as causing neurological damage also offered an explanation for why a successful time traveller might be unable to immediately share news of his achievement. Critics of the successful time travel theories point out that they require accepting not only that Markham's fundamental claims about time travel were correct, but also that he had achieved practical implementation of concepts that remain purely theoretical, even among professional physicists decades later. The energy requirements alone for any realistic form of temporal manipulation would be astronomically beyond what any individual could achieve with improvised equipment. More fundamentally, these theories require accepting that the laws of physics as currently understood are incomplete or incorrect in ways that would allow for the kind of space-time manipulation that Markham claimed to have achieved. While scientific understanding certainly continues to evolve, the specific claims about his experimental results contradict well-established principles that have been tested and confirmed through countless experiments and observations. The successful time travel theories also face the challenge of explaining why no other researcher has been able to replicate Markham's alleged results despite having access to his basic experimental design and theoretical framework. If time travel were achievable using the methods he described, it seems likely that other investigators would have achieved similar breakthroughs in the decades since his disappearance. A third category of theories focuses on the possibility that Markham's work had attracted the attention of government agencies or other powerful institutions that had intervened to suppress his research or exploit his discoveries. These theories typically cast Markham as either a victim of suppression or a recruit who was offered opportunities to continue his work within classified research programs. The government intervention theory draws support from documented historical cases of military and intelligence agencies monitoring or recruiting civilian researchers working on technologies with potential national security implications. The development of radar, nuclear weapons, and various other strategic technologies involved extensive government oversight of civilian research activities, sometimes including classification of results or recruitment of investigators into official programs. Given the obvious military applications that functional time travel technology would have, it would be reasonable to expect that any credible research in this area would attract official attention. If Markham's experiments had produced results that suggested genuine breakthrough potential, government agencies would have had strong incentives to either suppress the work to prevent it from reaching foreign adversaries, or to acquire it for their own strategic purposes. Proponents of this theory point to the systematic removal of Markham's experimental documentation as evidence of professional operation rather than amateur accident or voluntary disappearance. The complete absence of research materials suggests that someone with intelligence training had carefully sanitized the scene to prevent sensitive information from falling into unauthorized hands. The timing of Markham's disappearance shortly after announcing that his apparatus was ready for human trials also fits the pattern of government intervention that might be expected when civilian research approaches breakthrough results with strategic implications. Rather than allowing him to conduct potentially dangerous experiments that might have attracted wider attention or international scrutiny, agencies might have intervened at the crucial moment to either recruit him or terminate his research. However, the government intervention theory faces several practical challenges. The level of official attention and resources that would be required to monitor, evaluate, and potentially suppress Markham's work would be difficult to justify based on the experimental results he had described publicly. While his claims were extraordinary, the evidence supporting them remained largely anecdotal and unverified. The absence of any official records or acknowledgement of Markham's case also seems inconsistent with government intervention, since classified research programs typically leave bureaucratic traces even when their specific activities remain secret. The complete institutional amnesia surrounding his disappearance suggests either remarkably effective operational security, or more likely, the absence of significant official involvement. More fundamentally, the government intervention theory requires believing that agencies with access to vast resources and sophisticated research capabilities would need to rely on acquiring technology from an amateur investigator working with improvised equipment. While breakthrough discoveries can indeed emerge from unexpected sources, it seems more likely that any government agency interested in time travel research would pursue its own systematic investigation rather than depending on civilian amateurs. Beyond these major categories of explanation, numerous hybrid theories have emerged that combine elements from different approaches or propose completely novel interpretations of Markham's disappearance. Some suggest that his research had attracted the attention of extraterrestrial intelligences, who either recruited him for their own purposes or eliminated him as a potential threat to their activities on Earth. Others propose that Markham had stumbled upon naturally occurring temporal anomalies or dimensional portals that existed independently of his experimental apparatus, and that his disappearance resulted from accidental encounter with these phenomena rather than from his own technology. These theories often draw connections to alleged government research into similar phenomena, such as the rumors surrounding the Philadelphia experiment or various projects supposedly conducted at locations like Area 51. Still other theories focus on the possibility that Markham's experiments had attracted the attention of time travelers from the future, who had intervened to prevent him from developing technologies that might have catastrophic consequences for the timeline. According to these scenarios, his disappearance was a form of temporal protection that prevented him from inadvertently causing paradoxes or disruptions that could affect the future development of human civilization. The psychological and symbolic significance of these various theories extends far beyond their potential accuracy as explanations for what actually happened to Markham. Each theory reflects different assumptions about the nature of reality, the possibilities for individual achievement, and the forces that shape human destiny. The mundane theories, voluntary disappearance and accidental death, reflect worldviews that emphasize human agency and the operation of conventional physical laws. These explanations treat Markham as a recognizable human being facing comprehensible challenges and making decisions that can be understood within familiar frameworks of psychology and circumstance. The successful time travel theories reflect faith in the possibility of individual breakthrough discovery and the belief that reality contains possibilities that exceed current scientific understanding. These explanations treat Markham as a pioneering scientist whose work pushed beyond the boundaries of accepted knowledge into territories that remain unexplored by conventional research. The intervention theories, whether by government agencies, extraterrestrial intelligences, or time travelers, reflect beliefs about hidden forces that operate behind the scenes to influence human affairs. These explanations treat Markham as someone whose work threatened existing power structures or secret agendas, leading to suppression or recruitment by entities with capabilities far exceeding those of ordinary individuals. The persistence of multiple competing theories about Markham's fate, despite decades of investigation and speculation, demonstrates the fundamental challenge that extraordinary claims pose for rational evaluation. Without access to definitive evidence, people naturally gravitate toward explanations that align with their existing beliefs about what is possible and what forces shape human experience. Perhaps most significantly, the ongoing evolution and elaboration of theories about what happened to Markham reveals the deep human need to find meaning and pattern in mysteries that resist simple explanation. His story has become a kind of Rorschach test in which people see reflections of their own hopes, fears, and beliefs about the nature of reality and human potential. Whether any of these theories accurately describes what actually happened to Mike Markham may ultimately be less important than what they reveal about the enduring power of mystery to engage human imagination and the eternal tension between our desire for rational explanation and our fascination with the possibility that reality might exceed the boundaries of current understanding. In the quiet hours of the night, when the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes thin, these theories take on lives of their own, offering glimpses into the vast territories of possibility that surround the small islands of certainty on which we build our daily lives. Each theory invites us to consider what might be possible if the world were larger, stranger, and more wonderful than we typically allow ourselves to believe. In the vast digital landscape that has emerged since Mike Markham's disappearance, his story has found new life and evolved into something that transcends the original circumstances of his experiments and vanishing. What began as a series of radio interviews in the mid-1990s has transformed into a cornerstone of modern internet folklore, inspiring countless discussions, investigations, and creative interpretations that span multiple platforms, languages, and generations of online communities. The migration of Markham's story from radio waves to digital networks occurred gradually during the early years of widespread internet adoption. As coast-to-coast AM listeners discovered online forums and bulletin boards, they naturally brought their favourite stories and mysteries with them. Markham's case, with its combination of technical intrigue and unresolved questions, proved particularly well suited to the collaborative investigation and endless speculation that characterized early internet culture. The first major online discussions of Markham's case appeared on Usenet newsgroups and early web forums dedicated to paranormal phenomena, alternative science, and unexplained mysteries. These platforms provided something that radio broadcasting could not: permanent archives where information could be stored, referenced, and built upon over time. Unlike the ephemeral nature of live radio broadcasts, internet discussions created lasting records that allowed new participants to catch up on years of previous investigation and theory development. The collaborative nature of internet research also brought new analytical tools to bear on Markham's story. Users with diverse technical backgrounds could examine his claims from multiple perspectives, sharing expertise in physics, electrical engineering, psychology, and investigative methodology. This distributed intelligence often revealed aspects of his case that might have been overlooked by individual researchers working in isolation. One of the most significant early internet investigations focused on attempting to verify basic biographical information about Markham and cross-reference his story with official records. Researchers scoured online databases, newspaper archives, and public records to confirm details about his arrest, his experiments, and his disappearance. While this work succeeded in confirming many core elements of his story, it also revealed how little definitive information was actually available about his personal life and background. The systematic nature of internet research also highlighted inconsistencies and gaps in different versions of Markham's story, as it had been retold across various sources. Details that had been accepted without question in oral traditions suddenly became subject to careful scrutiny, when multiple accounts could be compared side by side in digital formats. This fact-checking process both strengthened and complicated Markham's legacy. On one hand, the verification of key details like his arrest and radio appearances lent credibility to his story and distinguished it from purely fictional accounts. On the other hand, the identification of embellishments and contradictions in secondary sources forced supporters to acknowledge that some popular elements of his legend might not be historically accurate. The visual nature of the internet also enabled new forms of engagement with Markham's story. Users began creating diagrams and schematics, attempting to reconstruct his experimental apparatus based on his radio descriptions. These technical illustrations often sparked detailed discussions about the feasibility of his designs and the physics principles that might or might not support his claimed results. Some amateur engineers and electronics enthusiasts even attempted to build their own versions of Jacob's ladder devices, with modifications similar to those Markham had described. While none reported achieving the extraordinary effects he claimed, these replication attempts provided valuable insights into the practical challenges and safety hazards involved in high-voltage experimentation. The Internet's capacity for multimedia content also led to the creation of audio compilations, video documentaries, and interactive timelines that presented Markham's story in formats that were more accessible and engaging than text-based discussions. These productions often reached audiences who might never have encountered his case through traditional paranormal or scientific channels. As social media platforms emerged and evolved, Markham's story found new venues for dissemination and discussion. Facebook groups, Reddit communities, YouTube channels, and Twitter threads all became spaces where different aspects of his case could be explored and debated. Each platform's unique characteristics shaped how his story was presented and discussed, creating multiple parallel versions of his legend that emphasized different elements and attracted different audiences. The algorithmic nature of modern social media has also influenced how Markham's story propagates across digital networks. Recommendation systems that suggest related content have created pathways that connect his case to broader discussions about time travel, government conspiracies, alternative science, and unexplained disappearances. This algorithmic cross-pollination has introduced his story to audiences who might never have sought out paranormal content but who became intrigued by the technical and mysterious aspects of his case. The international reach of internet platforms has also globalized Markham's story in ways that would have been impossible during the era of terrestrial radio broadcasting. Forums and social media groups in dozens of languages have discussed his experiments and disappearance, often incorporating cultural perspectives and theoretical frameworks that reflect different national attitudes towards science, government, and the paranormal. Some international communities have drawn connections between Markham's case and similar stories from their own cultural contexts, creating a kind of global mythology of amateur time travel research that transcends national boundaries. These cross-cultural comparisons have revealed both universal themes in how people respond to claims about breakthrough scientific discoveries and specific cultural factors that influence belief and skepticism. The persistence of interest in Markham's case across multiple decades of internet evolution demonstrates the story's remarkable staying power in an environment characterized by rapidly changing trends and shortened attention spans. Unlike many internet phenomena that experience brief periods of viral popularity before fading into obscurity, his story has maintained a consistent level of engagement that suggests deeper psychological and cultural resonance. This enduring fascination has created what amounts to a cottage industry of Markham-related content creation. Amateur investigators continue to produce documentaries, podcasts, and written analyses that explore different aspects of his case. Some focus on attempting to solve the mystery of his disappearance through conventional investigative methods, while others use his story as a launching point for broader discussions about the nature of time, space, and reality. The creative community has also embraced Markham's story as source material for fictional works that explore the themes and possibilities suggested by his case. Science fiction writers have used his experiments as inspiration for stories about amateur time travel research, while horror authors have explored the potentially sinister implications of his disappearance. These fictional treatments often blur the line between fact and imagination in ways that further complicate efforts to separate historical truth from legendary embellishment. The gaming community has also found inspiration in Markham's story, with independent developers creating video games that allow players to assume the role of amateur time travel researchers conducting dangerous experiments. These interactive experiences provide a form of engagement with his legacy that goes beyond passive consumption of information, allowing people to explore the theoretical and practical challenges that he might have faced. The academic community has gradually begun to recognize Markham's case as a valuable example of how contemporary legends develop and spread in digital environments. Folklorists, sociologists, and media studies scholars have used his story to explore questions about belief, evidence, and the social construction of a knowledge in the internet age. These scholarly investigations have revealed that Markham's story functions as much more than simple entertainment or paranormal speculation. Instead, it serves as a vehicle for exploring fundamental questions about the relationship between individual innovation and institutional authority, the role of amateur research in scientific advancement, and the psychological functions that mystery and wonder serve in modern technological society. The educational value of Markham's case has also been recognized by teachers and science communicators who use his story to engage students in discussions about experimental methodology, the evaluation of evidence, and the importance of peer review in scientific research. While his claims remain unverified, the technical aspects of his work provide excellent case studies for exploring the principles of physics and the challenges of conducting meaningful experiments. The ethical dimensions of Markham's story have also attracted attention from philosophers and ethicists interested in questions about the responsibilities that come with making extraordinary claims and the moral obligations that researchers have to their supporters and the broader public. His case raises complex questions about the balance between scientific freedom and public safety, particularly when dealing with potentially dangerous experimental technologies. The legal aspects of his case have similarly attracted attention from scholars interested in intellectual property law, missing persons investigations, and the regulatory frameworks that govern amateur scientific research. The absence of clear legal precedents for cases involving alleged time travel research has made his situation a useful thought experiment for exploring how existing legal systems might cope with genuinely revolutionary technological discoveries. The psychological aspects of belief and skepticism that Markham's story illuminates have also made it valuable to researchers studying cognitive biases, motivated reasoning, and the social psychology of extraordinary claims. His case provides a rich dataset for exploring how people evaluate evidence, form beliefs, and maintain convictions in the face of uncertainty and contradiction. The technological preservation of Markham's story through digital archives has also created new possibilities for long-term analysis that would not have been available for purely oral or print-based legends. Future researchers will have access to detailed records of how his story evolved, what aspects captured different audiences' attention, and how cultural attitudes towards science and the paranormal changed over time. This archival dimension adds historical significance to what might otherwise be dismissed as mere internet folklore. The detailed documentation of how contemporary legends develop and spread through digital networks provides valuable insights into the mechanisms of cultural transmission in the information age. The economic impact of Markham's story, while modest, also reflects its cultural significance. The production and consumption of related content has generated revenue for independent creators, supported niche publishing ventures, and contributed to the broader economy of paranormal and alternative science media. This economic dimension, however small, demonstrates that his story has achieved sufficient cultural resonance to support commercial enterprises. The inspirational dimension of Markham's legacy also deserves recognition. Regardless of whether his specific claims about time travel were accurate, his story has inspired countless individuals to pursue their own investigations into unexplored areas of science and technology. The model he provided of amateur research supported by voluntary collaboration has been replicated in various forms across different fields of investigation. Some contemporary amateur researchers explicitly cite Markham as an inspiration for their own work, seeing in his story proof that important discoveries can emerge from unexpected sources, and that institutional gatekeepers should not be allowed to determine the boundaries of legitimate investigation. This inspirational legacy may ultimately prove more significant than any specific technical achievements he might have claimed. The cautionary aspects of his story have also provided valuable lessons for other amateur researchers about the importance of safety protocols, documentation standards, and communication with the broader scientific community. The mysterious circumstances of his disappearance serve as a sobering reminder of the potential dangers involved in pushing the boundaries of known science without proper oversight and support. The international dimension of Markham's internet legacy has also contributed to cross-cultural dialogue about science, technology, and the nature of knowledge. Discussions of his case in different languages and cultural contexts have revealed both universal human responses to claims about the impossible and specific cultural factors that influence how such claims are received and evaluated. The feminist dimensions of responses to Markham's story have also attracted scholarly attention, as researchers have noted that the overwhelming majority of amateur time travel researchers and their supporters appear to be male. This gender disparity raises interesting questions about cultural attitudes toward risk-taking, technological innovation, and the appeal of time travel as a concept. The generational aspects of his legacy are also worth noting. While his original story emerged during the early days of the internet, new generations of digital natives continue to discover and engage with his case through platforms and media that did not exist during his lifetime. Each generation brings its own technological literacy and cultural perspectives to his story, ensuring its continued evolution and relevance. The environmental impact of Markham's story, while minimal, also reflects broader questions about the sustainability of digital culture and the energy costs associated with maintaining the vast archives of information that preserve contemporary legends like his. The carbon footprint of the servers and networks that keep his story alive represents a tiny but real environmental investment in cultural preservation. As we consider the full scope of Mike Markham's digital legacy, what emerges is a picture of how a single individual's extraordinary claims can ripple outward through information networks to touch countless lives and inspire ongoing investigation, creativity, and reflection. His transformation from a young man conducting electrical experiments in rural Missouri to a permanent fixture of internet folklore represents one of the more remarkable journeys in the annals of digital culture. As we reach the end of our journey through the remarkable story of Mike Markham, we find ourselves in that quiet space where questions linger longer than answers, where mystery proves more enduring than certainty. In the gentle hours of the night, when the boundary between what we know and what we wonder becomes beautifully blurred, his tale continues to whisper possibilities that challenge our understanding of what might be achievable when human curiosity meets unwavering determination. Who was Mike Markham, really? Strip away the speculation, the theories, and the mythological elaborations that have accumulated around his name, and we find a young man whose story embodies some of humanity's most persistent dreams and deepest anxieties. He was, at his core, someone who refused to accept that the boundaries of the possible were fixed and immutable. Someone who believed that the mysteries of existence could be unlocked through patient investigation and bold experimentation. In the rolling hills of rural Missouri, far from the prestigious laboratories and well-funded research institutions where breakthrough discoveries are supposedly made, Markham dared to ask whether time itself might be malleable, whether the linear progression from past to future that governs our daily existence might be nothing more than a limitation waiting to be overcome. The audacity of this question, regardless of whether his proposed answers were correct, places him within a tradition of visionary thinkers who have always pushed against the boundaries of accepted knowledge. There is something profoundly American about Markham's story. This faith in individual innovation, this belief that important discoveries can emerge from unexpected places, this willingness to risk everything in pursuit of an impossible dream. From the Wright brothers conducting experiments with flight in their Dayton bicycle shop, to Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak building the first Apple computer in a California garage, our cultural mythology celebrates the lone inventor whose passion and persistence overcome institutional skepticism and conventional wisdom. Whether Markham ultimately succeeded or failed in his specific goals may be less important than what he represented. The enduring human conviction that reality contains more possibilities than we have yet discovered, and that those possibilities remain accessible to anyone with sufficient curiosity and courage to pursue them. In an age of increasing technological complexity and institutional specialization, his story offers reassurance that the frontier of human knowledge has not been entirely claimed by experts and professionals. The mystery surrounding his disappearance adds another layer of meaning to his legacy, transforming what might have been a simple story of scientific success or failure into something more profound and lasting. By vanishing at the crucial moment when his work supposedly reached its culmination, Markham became something more than an inventor or researcher. He became a symbol of humanity's eternal quest to transcend the limitations of existence itself. The questions raised by his story extend far beyond the technical feasibility of time travel or the specific details of his experimental methodology. His case forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, the reliability of institutions, and the criteria we use to distinguish between legitimate investigation and elaborate delusion. How do we evaluate extraordinary claims when the evidence remains ambiguous and the theoretical framework challenges everything we think we know about physical reality? What obligations do we have to take seriously the work of amateur researchers who lack formal credentials but demonstrate genuine dedication and apparent technical competence? When does healthy skepticism become closed-minded dismissal? And when does open-minded curiosity become dangerous gullibility? These questions have no easy answers, which is perhaps why Markham's story continues to fascinate and divide audiences decades after his disappearance. Different people, approaching his case with different assumptions and priorities, naturally reach different conclusions about his credibility and the significance of his work. This diversity of interpretation reflects the deep philosophical divisions that characterize human responses to claims about the impossible. The collaborative dimension of Markham's research, facilitated by his appearances on Coast to Coast AM and supported by contributions from listeners around the world, also points toward new possibilities for how scientific investigation might be conducted in an age of global communication and distributed intelligence. His story demonstrates that important research questions can engage the attention and resources of people far beyond traditional academic and institutional boundaries. The international and intergenerational appeal of his story suggests that it addresses concerns and aspirations that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. The dream of conquering time, of gaining the power to correct past mistakes or glimpse future possibilities, speaks to something fundamental in human nature that crosses all lines of nationality, education, and belief. Yet there is also something deeply personal and intimate about Markham's journey that makes his story compelling beyond its grand theoretical implications. Here was a young man, not much different from countless others in small towns across America, who became convinced that he had stumbled upon one of the universe's greatest secrets. The isolation and pressure that characterized his final months remind us of the human costs that can accompany the pursuit of extraordinary goals. The tragic possibility that his dedication to his research might have contributed to his disappearance serves as a sobering reminder that the quest for knowledge, however noble, must be balanced against considerations of safety, communication, and connection with the broader human community. Genius untempered by wisdom, curiosity unconstrained by caution, can lead to destinations from which return becomes impossible. The transformation of his story from contemporary mystery into enduring legend reflects the deep human need for narratives that preserve wonder and possibility in a world that often seems increasingly predictable and constrained. In an age of instant communication and ubiquitous surveillance, the idea that someone could simply vanish without trace carries an almost romantic appeal that transcends rational evaluation. The Internet's role in preserving and evolving Markham's story also illustrates how digital technologies have fundamentally altered the relationship between individual experience and collective memory. Where previous generations of extraordinary claims might have been forgotten or relegated to purely local folklore, his story has achieved a kind of digital immortality that ensures its continued availability to future generations. This technological preservation comes with both benefits and challenges. While it ensures that his story will not be lost to time, it also means that the accumulated layers of speculation, embellishment, and mythologization that surround his case may eventually obscure whatever historical truth might lie at its foundation. Future researchers will have access to vast archives of discussion and analysis, but they will also face the challenge of separating authentic documentation from creative elaboration. The educational value of Markham's story, regardless of its ultimate factual accuracy, lies in the questions it raises about methodology, evidence, and the social processes through which knowledge is validated and accepted. His case provides an excellent framework for exploring the principles of scientific investigation, the importance of peer review, and the challenges that face anyone attempting to evaluate extraordinary claims. For students of science, his story illustrates both the importance of following proper experimental procedures and the dangers of working in isolation without adequate oversight and collaboration. For students of psychology, it demonstrates the complex interplay between belief, evidence, and wishful thinking that characterizes human responses to claims about the impossible. For students of sociology, his case reveals how extraordinary claims spread through social networks and how different communities develop different criteria for evaluating evidence and reaching conclusions. The divide between believers and skeptics that characterized responses to his story reflects broader cultural tensions about the relationship between individual innovation and institutional authority. Perhaps most importantly, Markham's story serves as a reminder that the universe remains vast and mysterious, despite centuries of scientific progress. While his specific claims about time travel may never be verified, his willingness to ask fundamental questions about the nature of reality reflects the kind of curiosity and boldness that has driven human progress throughout history. The greatest scientists and inventors have always been willing to challenge conventional assumptions and explore possibilities that others dismissed as impossible. Whether Markham belongs in their company may depend less on whether his specific theories were correct than on whether his approach to investigation embodied the intellectual courage and dedication that characterize genuine seekers of truth. The persistence of mystery surrounding his fate ensures that his story will continue to inspire new generations of investigators, dreamers, and questioners. In libraries and laboratories, in online forums and late-night conversations, people will continue to wonder what really happened to the young man from Missouri who claimed to have unlocked one of time's greatest secrets. As we settle deeper into the quiet embrace of the night, allowing Markham's story to drift through our consciousness like smoke from a distant fire, we can appreciate the profound human themes that his case illuminates. His journey from obscure amateur experimenter to legendary figure represents more than just an unusual chapter in the annals of paranormal folklore. It embodies the eternal tension between human ambition and natural limitation, between our dreams of transcendence and our acceptance of mortality. The questions that his story raises about the nature of time itself invite us to consider our own relationship with the temporal flow that carries us from moment to moment, day to day, year to year. If time travel were indeed possible, what would we choose to change about our past? What futures would we seek to explore? And what responsibilities would come with such godlike power over the fundamental structure of existence? These philosophical reflections extend naturally into the realm of personal meaning and purpose. Markham's dedication to his research, regardless of its ultimate validity, demonstrates the human capacity for sustained effort in service of goals that transcend immediate practical benefit. His story reminds us that the most meaningful pursuits are often those that stretch our capabilities and challenge our assumptions about what might be possible. The collaborative aspect of his work, supported by contributions from strangers who believed in the importance of his investigations, also speaks to the power of shared dreams and collective effort. Even if his specific goals were never achieved, the community that formed around his research created connections and conversations that enriched the lives of all who participated. In the end, perhaps the most lasting legacy of Mike Markham's remarkable journey lies not in any specific technical achievements or theoretical breakthroughs, but in his demonstration that curiosity and wonder remain alive in our contemporary world. At a time when scientific investigation is increasingly dominated by large institutions and specialized expertise, his story reminds us that important questions can still capture the imagination of ordinary individuals and inspire extraordinary efforts. The mystery that surrounds his ultimate fate serves as a gentle reminder that despite our technological advances and accumulated knowledge, the universe still holds secrets that resist easy explanation. In a culture often characterized by instant answers and immediate gratification, the enduring questions raised by his case offer the deeper satisfaction that comes from contemplating mysteries that may never be fully resolved. As the hours grow late and consciousness begins its gentle drift towards sleep, we can carry with us the wonder that Markham's story evokes, not just about the possibility of time travel, but about the larger mysteries that surround our existence. In the quiet spaces between waking and dreaming, between certainty and speculation, between what we know and what we imagine, his tale continues to whisper possibilities that make the darkness a little less lonely and the unknown a little less fearsome. Let the questions his story raises settle gently in your mind like snowflakes on still water. What drove him to risk everything in pursuit of the impossible? What forces shape the boundary between dream and reality? What secrets might await discovery by anyone bold enough to ask the right questions and patient enough to seek their answers? In the vast tapestry of human experience, Mike Markham's thread may be brief and mysterious, but it adds colours and patterns that enrich the whole. His story reminds us that every individual life contains the potential for extraordinary purpose, that every moment holds the possibility for discovery, and that every dream of transcendence reflects something essential about the human spirit. Whether he succeeded in conquering time or simply vanished into its depths, whether he achieved his impossible goal or fell victim to his own ambition, Mike Markham's journey from small-town tinkerer to legendary figure demonstrates that the most important human adventures are those that dare to explore the boundaries between the known and the unknowable. As sleep begins to claim you, let his story serve as a gentle reminder that mystery and wonder remain woven into the fabric of existence, waiting for anyone curious enough to notice and bold enough to investigate. In the morning, the questions will remain, as they always do, inviting new generations of dreamers to take up the eternal human quest to understand the deepest secrets of time, space, and the endlessly fascinating mystery of consciousness itself. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the vast reaches of possibility, the questions that drove Mike Markham continue their patient wait for answers, and that the wonder he embodied remains alive in every heart that refuses to accept that the impossible must forever remain beyond reach.